Chapter 481. The huge wooden ship was like an ancient beast, galloping on the Tongming River, riding the wind and breaking the waves. The white waves spread to the left and right under the impact of the ship's keel, forming waves that were close to 20 meters tall. The waves only weakened after reaching several hundred meters away, turning into layers of ripples that spread out. This ship was completely black. It was 120 meters long and 30 meters tall. It was like a huge whale, moving at lightning speed as it crossed the Tongming River. On the side of the black ship, there was a picture of a golden flood dragon, proving the origin of this ship. The golden flood dragon. The Tongming River was very long. It was said that it traversed the entire ancient Sword continent. In other words, other than the Eastern Sword domain, the other 3 Sword domains also had Tongming River. It was also one of the paths from the 3 Sword domains to the Central Sword domain. And the final flow of the Tongming River was the Outer Sea. That was a place that existed beyond the ancient Sword continent. As for the width, due to the change in terrain, the width of the Tongming River was also different. The widest part was even 10 times wider than the narrowest part. From the port of the Eastern Sword domain to the corresponding port of the Central Sword domain, riding a large ship like the Golden Flood Dragon would still take half a year. Of course, if one rode on a flying demonic beast, it would be even faster. However, don't forget that there was no place to rest on the Tongming River. No demonic beast could fly for months without rest. Moreover, the Tongming River also had a special characteristic. The longer one flew in the air, the greater the consumption, and the easier it would be to feel tired. Furthermore, one might encounter wind, rain, fog, and so on. In short, unless one was a powerful swordsman who was extremely confident in his own strength, or had some special treasure or powerful flying demonic beast, one would choose to ride a large ship to cross the Tongming River. One person had to pay 1,000 mid-grade spirit stones to obtain the right to ride a large ship. The huge wooden ship that was 120 meters long and 30 meters tall could accommodate hundreds to thousands of people at the same time. Basically, everyone would be able to obtain a small but well-decorated room. In addition, the ship also provided food and drinks, and so on. At this moment, the sun was shining brightly as the Golden Flood Dragon rode the wind and waves on the bright river. In the corner of the ship, there was a moon-white figure sitting on a chair. It was a young man wearing a moon-white robe. He looked to be around 24 or 25 years old. This young man's appearance was not very handsome, but he gave people a feeling of being bathed in the spring breeze, as if he could contain all things in the world. At first glance, it made people feel comfortable, especially his eyes, which were so clear that one could see the bottom of a pool of clear water. But when you really wanted to see the bottom, you would find that it was just an illusion. His eyes were incomparably deep, like the sky. Just like that, the young man didn't blink. He stared at the boundless bright river and the rolling waves. There seemed to be an endless river flowing in his eyes. Not far away, some people were sizing up this young man in a moon-white robe and pointing at him. Basically, everyone on the Golden Flood Dragon knew the identity of the white-robed youth. Zhen Tian Sword Master, Chu Mu. The Sword Master King of the Eastern Sword region, the Sword Master King who defeated the arrogant Raging Waves Sword Master with one sword strike with absolute strength. The people on the Golden Flood Dragon felt very honored because they were actually on the same ship as Chu Mu. In their hearts they were very excited. This was a kind of honor. Perhaps, many years later, when Chu Mu became even more powerful and his name shook the entire ancient Sword continent, they could proudly tell their descendants that they were once on the same ship as Chu Mu. To ordinary people or those swordsmen with average talent, this was an unparalleled honor. Say, should we go and get to know Chu Mu? I want to, but I don't dare. Although they really wanted to get to know Chu Mu and let him know their names, they also knew that they were just ordinary Chi-Hai swordsmen. Although Chu Mu was also a Chi-Hai swordsman, and only had the sword Chi of Deshang, he was a sword master, and the king of the sword masters. Many people had the thought of getting to know Chu Mu. Unfortunately, no one dared to take action because their hearts were nervous and apprehensive. Chu Mu didn't know what others were thinking, and he didn't want to know. To him, this was a rare opportunity to be quiet. He knew that it would take half a year to cross the Tongming River, and he could use this half a year to cultivate. The Sky Baron sword chi art was of a very high grade, and the Sky Baron sword chi that was cultivated was incomparably pure. Naturally, it would take more time. Therefore, until now, Chu Mu's sword chi was only at the chi high realm. However, he estimated that within this half a year, he should be able to reach the peak of the Deshang realm. At that time, his overall strength should be slightly increased. However, this wasn't the most important thing. In half a year, Chu Mu was confident that his sword chi and control of the heaven and earth spirit chi could be further improved. This was the most important factor for his strength to increase. During the battle with Wild Wave Sword Master Qing Tianlan, Chu Mu's sword chi was at 18%, and he didn't hide it. When he defeated Lai Kongyang, his sword intent was at 12%. After that, his sword intent would increase by 1% every 3 months. During the 1 month of meditation in the East Sage Hall, his sword intent had increased by 2%, reaching the current 18%. The power of the beheading moon with the 18% sword chi was even more terrifying. In addition to Chu Mu's monstrous perception and other factors, the power of the beheading moon was much stronger than the Wild Wave sword with the 18% sword chi. This meant that in terms of understanding and creation of sword skills, Chu Mu far surpassed Qing Tianlan. As for the control of the heaven and earth spirit chi, when Chu Mu reached the chi high realm, he had already grasped 30%. Now, his control had reached 80%. Chu Mu felt that after half a year, his control of the heaven and earth spirit chi could reach 90%, but it wouldn't be easy to reach 100%. Many sword masters continuously accumulated in order to reach 100% control of the heaven and earth spirit chi, and then break through to the 9th transformation realm. However, most of the sword masters couldn't wait until that moment because their accumulation reached its limit, and they were forced to break through. There were too few swordsmen like Lai Kongyang, who had only broken through to the 9th revolution realm after 13 years of accumulation and had finally achieved 100% control over the heaven and earth spirit chi. According to the records, those who could reach 100% control of the heaven and earth spirit chi before breaking through would often reach the 9th transformation realm faster, and their foundation would be more stable. It would also be easier for them to reach the origin realm. I estimate that in about 2 years, Lai Kongyang will be able to reach the 9th transformation realm and become a origin realm sword master. Chu Mu thought to himself, the Sky Baron sword chi art is very powerful, but the training speed is too slow. The possibility of me reaching the origin realm within 3 years is very small. After all, Chu Mu was only confident that he could reach the peak of the Chi High realm within 3 years. As for reaching the peak of the Chi High realm, he only had a 30% chance. Fortunately, once he reached the peak of the Chi High realm, he would be able to break through and reach the 9th transformation realm. He wouldn't have to suppress his cultivation like the other sword masters and slowly accumulate. But every monster was special. Every day, Chu Mu would stay in his room and train the Sky Baron sword chi. After training, he would go to the corner of the deck to comprehend the sword intent and control the heaven and earth spirit chi. He would also comprehend some sword skills. At night, he would spend some time reading the records. On the Golden Dragon, there were some records specially prepared. The contents of the records were about the culture of the Central Sword region. It was very suitable for people who entered the Central Sword region for the first time. In the blink of an eye, 3 months had passed. Chu Mu's eyes suddenly shot out a sharp sword light. The sword light disappeared into the void. The Tongming River in front of him seemed to have been cut open by an invisible longsword, leaving a mark. It took 3 breaths for the river to return to its original state. Sword intent at 19%. It seems that when I reach the central sword region, my sword intent should be able to reach 20%. Chumu thought to himself. Sword intent below 10% was superficial. 10% to 30% was entry level. 40% was minor success. 70% was Deshang, and 100% was complete. The difference between Deshang and Deshang was very obvious. According to legends, a powerful sword master who had accumulated a lot of experience would be able to kill a normal origin realm sword master once he comprehended the sword intent to the minor success level, which was 40%. One had to know that the origin realm and the Qi High realm were separated by the 9th transformation realm. Although some people only needed a year to pass the 9th transformation realm, the difference was not to be underestimated. It was like the difference between the sky and the earth. Even the weakest origin realm swordsman would be able to kill a sword hero who had been practicing for 7 to 8 years with just a normal sword origin. Even a sword hero who had been practicing for 10 years would not be able to survive. Among all the sword masters in the Eastern Sword region, there were very few who had accumulated for 10 years. As for whether the legend was true or not, no one could be sure. Because until now, there had never been any news of a sword master who had comprehended 40% of sword intent. It was already very rare for a sword master to be able to comprehend sword intent. Those who had comprehended 10% were even rarer. 40% was just a fantasy. The boredom of riding the ship seemed to have disappeared. Chumu had become the center of discussion again and again. In the blink of an eye, another 3 months had passed. Standing at the bow of the ship, one could vaguely see a black shadow in front of them. Everyone knew that it was the outline of the land, and the central sword region was right in front of them. Chumu opened his palm. There was a chi swirling around his palm. It was a chi whirlpool. The white chi whirlpool made a whooshing sound. 90% of the chi was milky white. This meant that Chumu's control of the chi of heaven and earth had reached 90%. He was only 10% away from 100% completion. With a clench of his palm, the chi whirlpool dissipated and turned into rays of milky white chi that shot out from his fingers like spiritual snake. Chumu's eyes flashed. It was as if an invisible sword was slashing through the air, seemingly able to cut through all things. Sword intent. 20%. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 482. The port of the central main sword region was much bigger and more majestic than the port of the east sword region. The various facilities were clearly not comparable to the port of the east sword region. There were more people coming and going, and the level of prosperity was many times that of the port of the east sword region. When the people on the Golden Flood Dragon stepped off the steps, a feeling arose from the bottom of their hearts. It was as though they had entered a big city from a small town. The impact of the aura caused them to lose focus instantly. As expected of the central main sword region, Chumu's eyes flashed with a tinge of surprise. Before stepping onto the land of the central main sword region, Chumu could only feel that the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was indeed 2 to 3 times denser than that of the east sword region. But once he stepped onto the land of the central main sword region, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth surged like endless waves. 10 times. Even in such a crowded port, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was still 10 times that of the average level of the east sword region. Just the port alone has such dense spiritual energy. What if it was in the mountain gates of those sword sects? Chumu thought for a moment and could not help but gasp. Generally speaking, sects would usually be built in places with dense spiritual energy. The denser the spiritual energy, the stronger the sect. Otherwise, if one was not strong enough, they would only be targeted by stronger sections. If they did not have enough strength, they would only be targeted by stronger sections. If they did not migrate in humiliation, they would be exterminated. And sects based in places with dense spiritual energy would continuously become stronger due to the dense spiritual energy. Their foundation would become deeper and deeper, and they would be above other sections. It could be said that the spiritual energy of heaven and earth at the location of those strong sword sects was unbelievably dense. It was at least 10 times or even dozens of times denser than in places like the port. Just think about it. If one cultivated in such an environment, their progress would be shocking, and the purity of the spiritual energy would be shocking. It was no wonder that the central main sword region was so many times stronger than the other 4 main sword regions. It was no wonder that the swordsmen of the central main sword region had such high standards. A sword master ranked 10th on the Heavenly Sword Hero roll actually regarded the sword masters of the East Sword region as nothing and treated it as a rural place. It was just like a person who was born in a big city and lived and studied in all kinds of superior environments. If he suddenly went to a backward place in the countryside, it was inevitable that he would despise and even despise it from the bottom of his heart. In such an environment, even a person as stupid as a pig could easily reach the Qi transformation realm or even the Qi high realm. But in the Eastern Sword domain, many sword practitioners stopped at the half-step Qi transformation realm, many sword practitioners stopped at the peak of Qi transformation realm, and many sword practitioners had to put in a lot of effort to barely reach the Qi high realm. It had to be said that comparisons were odious. Unfortunately, Chu Mu cultivated the heavenly wasteland sword Qi, which had nothing to do with the spiritual Qi of heaven and earth. He was also unable to absorb the spiritual Qi of heaven and earth and transform it into the heavenly wasteland sword Qi. Otherwise, his cultivation speed would definitely increase by a lot. But no matter what, being in this kind of rich spiritual Qi of heaven and earth would always make people feel comfortable from the bottom of their hearts. Their bodies would be constantly nourished, their physical strength would be more abundant, their energy would be full, and it would be easier for them to recover. Taking a deep breath, his entire body felt relaxed. Chu Mu stood on the harbor and looked up at the sky. The sky of the central sword domain seemed to be even bluer, deeper, and wider. The drifting white clouds were even larger and denser. Soon after, Chu Mu lowered his head and slowly swept his gaze over it, as if he wanted to imprint everything in his surroundings into his heart. From here onwards, I will embark on the path of the sword that belongs to me. Chu Mu thought to himself. The voice echoed in his mind and rumbled into the depths of his soul, forming a brand that would last for eternity. His blood was about to boil. A trace of excitement flashed across Chu Mu's face subconsciously, and his eyes were filled with excitement. He was no longer a rookie who didn't know anything. He had a deeper understanding of the importance of luck in this world. After becoming a sword hero, he had obtained a trace of luck. Under the battle for luck, that trace of luck had been nourished and increased by several times. Chu Mu could clearly feel the benefits of an increase in luck. At the very least, it had slightly increased his comprehension. As Chu Mu, who relied on his comprehension to constantly become stronger, the power of luck was very important. Chu Mu also understood why those powerful swordsmen did not conceal their identity. Instead, they moved forward bravely, making their names resound through the ages. The reason was very simple. When one's reputation reached a certain level, they would obtain the recognition of the heavenly Tao. The heavenly Tao was supreme and ruled over everything. Everything was under the jurisdiction and restrictions of the heavenly Tao. As a result, to obtain the recognition of the heavenly Tao, no matter who it was, even those high and mighty sword saints would attach great importance to it. Of course, the so-called recognition of the heavenly Tao was actually just a trace of recognition. After all, the heavenly Tao was supreme. A trace of recognition was enough to make a swordsman stand out among all the geniuses. There were many ways to obtain a trace of recognition from the heavenly Tao, but the most direct way was to make one's name known. Whether it was being listed on the heavenly sword ranking or other things, it was a way to increase one's reputation. Those swordsmen who were listed on the heavenly sword ranking were all blessed with additional luck. If this continued, the gap between them and those swordsmen who were not listed on the heavenly sword ranking would gradually increase with the passage of time. As for those swordsmen who had obtained the inheritance of the sword principle, in addition to mastering a powerful sword principle, they also obtained a trace of luck inheritance. However, it was ultimately given by others. I want to be on the heavenly sword ranking. I also want to challenge powerful swordsmen, Chu Mu said to himself, the light in his eyes burning brighter and brighter. When he was still on earth, in order to pursue the peak of swordsmanship, after becoming a swordsmanship master, he began to challenge swordsmanship experts everywhere to hone his swordsmanship. Only then could he become stronger in a shorter period of time. In the end, he vaguely became the number one person below the sword master level. A few years ago, Chu Mu had already decided that once he had sufficient strength, he would start to challenge and improve himself, just like he did on Earth. To him, there was no longer anyone in the Eastern sword domain that he could challenge. The king of swordsmen, there was no one in the Eastern sword domain who could fight with him. As for those ninth transformation realm swordsmen, unless it was a matter of life and death, they would definitely not make a move. All of them were in seclusion. Otherwise, how could there not be any ninth transformation realm swordsman in the vast Eastern sword domain? As for the original realm swordsmen, they had no chance of winning. On the contrary, they would be ruthlessly beaten up or even killed. That was not a challenge at all. However, the central main sword domain was different. It was dozens of times larger than the Eastern sword domain, and the spiritual chi was at least 10 times denser than the Eastern sword domain. It had outstanding talents and a huge population that was at least 100 times larger than the Eastern sword domain. The geniuses that were born in such a place were 100 times or even 1,000 times more than the Eastern sword domain. In such a place there were countless geniuses and experts. It was a place that was worth challenging. Basically, every sword hero that stepped into the central main sword domain would not choose to hide. Instead, they would make a name for themselves because they all understood the concept of fate. No matter if it was the decision made a few years ago or the concept of fate, it all made Chu Mu want to truly take that step and walk on his own path of sword Tao. This year, Chu Mu was 24.5 years old. He was at the peak of Deshang realm, Tearing intent realm, 80% illusionary intent realm, and 20% sword intent realm. He took a step forward. This step was incomparably firm. It symbolized Chu Mu's first step in the central main sword domain. His path was still very long, and his future was still very far away. However, his determination would not waver. His steps would not be cheap. Step by step, he would leave behind his own legend in the central main sword domain. The central main sword domain, what a great place! At the port of the central main sword domain opposite the western sword domain, a young swordsman wearing a black robe with golden edges took a deep breath. He had an intoxicated expression on his face, but there was a sword intent that shot up into the sky from his body. It stirred up the wind and clouds, which attracted countless people's attention. All of them were shocked. The central main sword domain, this is the beginning of my legend. The eagle flies in the sky, the dragon returns to the sea. This is my battlefield. At the port of the central main sword domain, opposite the northern sword domain, a tall and powerful young swordsman, wearing some kind of beast skin, said with an overbearing tone. The chi he was emitting was too strong and powerful. No one dared to get close to him within 100-meter radius. The central main sword domain, I want to challenge all the powerful sword heroes here. My goal is to reach the peak of sword Tao. I want to give up everything that is not sword Tao. The central main sword domain, this is the beginning of my emotionless sword Tao. At the port of the central main sword domain opposite the southern sword domain, A tall and slim female swordsman wearing snow-white clothes said to herself. She was like a 10,000-year-old ice that would never melt. That horrifying cold chi seemed to be able to freeze everything in the world and extinguish all life. Within a 1,000-meter radius, the ground seemed to be covered in a layer of white frost. No one dared to get close to her. Emotionless Sword Tao, extinguishing all emotions. In her eyes there was a terrifying coldness. Geniuses of the central main sword domain, just you wait. Wash your necks clean and wait for my sword to chop off your heads. Coming from the outer sea, at the bow of a ship that was several times larger than the golden flood dragon, stood a ramrod-straight figure. His hands were behind his back as he faced the wind. Under the onslaught of the vast sea breeze, his robes fluttered. The violent sea breeze that could blow a few thousand kilograms into the sky was unable to shake him in the slightest. Today I am already the strongest sword hero in the outer sea. I am fully deserving of the title of Sword Hero King. There is no sword hero in the outer sea that is worthy of my sword. The central main sword domain, the legendary gathering place of Sword Tao, do not disappoint me. Heavenly Sword Tower, Heavenly Sword Hero ranking, I will definitely be ranked first. No one can replace me. Not only the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking, but also the Heavenly Sword Sovereign ranking and the Heavenly Sword of Gojosian ranking. In the future, I will also be ranked first. I will surpass all the Sword of Gojosian and become a Sword Tao Saint. At the same time, at the center of the central main sword domain, an ancient existence seemed to have sensed something. He let out a soft sigh. It was impossible to tell whether he was happy or sad. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 483. Tianhe County was the first stop from the Eastern Sword Region's port to the Central Sword Region. As it was close to the Tongming River, it was named Tianhe County. The Central Sword Region's system was completely different from the Eastern Sword Region. The Eastern Sword Region was dominated by the 10 great dynasties. Each dynasty had a few sword sects, such as the Maluo Sword Sect and the Vajra Sword Sect. There were no dynasties in the Central Sword Region, only dynasties. The Ancient Sword Dynasty was the only one. The Ancient Sword Dynasty had a long history. It was said that it had existed for more than 100,000 years. It had once ruled the entire ancient sword continent and dominated the world. Dynasties came from all directions, and even the outer seas had to obey its orders. However, everything in the world had its own rules. When things reached an extreme, they would move in the opposite direction. The powerful ancient sword dynasty gradually declined. The outer seas that were once under the ancient sword dynasty's jurisdiction completely broke away and became stronger. In the end, they developed to the point where they surpassed the ancient sword continent. The sword sects that had once submitted to the ancient sword dynasty also grew rapidly and became stronger. In the end, they broke away from the ancient sword dynasty's control and became independent of the dynasty. Even so, the ancient sword dynasty had once ruled the entire ancient sword continent and made the powerful outer seas submit. Although it had declined, its foundation was still deep. As the saying went, a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. This was the current situation of the ancient sword dynasty. Therefore, even if the sword sects became stronger and broke away from the dynasty's control and even had the strength to challenge the dynasty, they were still unwilling to be enemies with the declining ancient sword dynasty. This formed a strange balance. Now, most of the land in the Central Sword Region was still under the control of the ancient sword dynasty. It was still divided according to the previous system. The Central Sword Region was divided into 33 prefectures. Each prefecture had its own counties. The largest was 18 counties and the smallest was 8 counties. For example, the Tianhe County that Chu Mu was in now was under the jurisdiction of the Thousand River Prefecture. Under the Thousand River Prefecture, there were a total of 10 counties. The counties in the central sword region were very big. Chu Mu, who had been here for a month, fully understood. The area of the Tianhe County alone was half the size of the Great Kuan dynasty. According to this calculation, just the area of the Thousand River Mansion was equivalent to the area of the Eastern Sword Domain's 5 dynasties combined. Of course, this calculation was not accurate, because some counties were bigger than others. In any case, this was the first time Chu Mu realized the vastness of the central main sword domain. 33 prefectures, 400 to 500 counties, and all sorts of other places. No wonder it was said that the central main sword domain was many times larger than the other 4 main sword domains combined. After today's battle, I will leave Tianhe County and head west. I'll challenge my way and pass by Pingyang County to visit the Li family. Then I'll reach the Heavenly Sword Tower. In a restaurant, Chu Mu sat at a table near the window. He drank wine and looked at the scenery outside the window as he thought to himself, "That must be the Jintian sword hero Chu Mu from the Eastern Sword Domain. That's right, it's him. It's said that he's not even 25 years old yet, but he's the sword hero king of the Eastern Sword region. He possesses a sword intent of 18%. Your information is outdated. 7 months ago, his sword intent was 18%. Could it be that after 7 months, it hasn't improved at all? Maybe it has already increased to 19%. I also heard that when he was in the Eastern Sword region, he defeated Qing Tianlan, who was ranked 10th on the Central Main Sword Domain sword ranking. I see. No wonder he could defeat all the strong Qi High Realm swordsmen in our Tianhe County. This evening, he will fight with the number 1 Qi High Realm swordsman in Tianhe County, Leng Wufeng. I must go and watch. Leng Wufeng? That's a very strong Qi High Realm swordsman. If it wasn't for his age, he could have gotten the title of sword hero. The discussion in the restaurant was very soft, but to Chu Mu, who had already perfected his listening sword, it was very clear. Leng Wufeng. Chu Mu's lips curled into a smile. When he stepped into the central main sword domain, he started to challenge. Because he was not familiar enough, Chu Mu used a few days to gather information and find out which strong swordsmen were in the Tianhe County. Chu Mu's challenges had a standard. It didn't matter if he was a sword hero or not. In this world, there were many swordsmen who didn't have the title of sword hero but had the power of a sword hero. Especially in the central main sword domain, there were even more of them. Although it was said that becoming a sword grandmaster would allow one to obtain an additional trace of the power of providence, those who did not obtain the title of sword grandmaster were mostly people who matured late in life. They could not reach the level of a sword grandmaster within the age limit, but some of them had relied on their own efforts to obtain the strength of a sword grandmaster. A small number of them had some special encounters or received some kind of inheritance. Not only did they have the power of a sword hero, they also had the luck that they should have. Their growth speed was not slower than many sword heroes, and could even be compared to those genius sword heroes. Basically, in this month, the 10 Qi High Realm swordsmen that Chu Mu challenged didn't have the title of sword hero, but all of them had comprehended sword intent. The least was 2 or 3%, and the most was 7 or 8%. They were all in their 40s, and had been immersed in the use of sword intent for many years, but none of them had mastered a complete sword skill. In terms of sword intent, they couldn't be compared to Chu Mu. In terms of the power of incomplete sword skills, they couldn't be compared to Chu Mu either. But they had been immersed in sword intent for a long time, and in terms of the use of sword intent, there were some subtle aspects that Chu Mu could learn from. When 3 people walk together, there is always one to learn from. Maybe a person who wasn't as strong as you might have something that you could learn from. Leng Wufeng was Chu Mu's last target in the Sky River County. He was also the number 1 Qi High swordsman in the Sky River County. The information that Chu Mu had received was very clear. Leng Wufeng was 38 years old this year, and had reached the peak of the Qi High realm 10 years ago. 7 years ago, he had a special encounter and inherited the windless sword art. What he had learned was the windless sword art, and its power was 20% higher than the windless sword art. It was said that a year ago, the sword intent that he had displayed had reached 13%. Originally, his name was not Lingwufeng, but after he had inherited the windless sword art, his windless sword art had also mutated into the windless sword art. That was why he changed his name to Lingwufeng. In the center of the Sky River County, outside the Sky River City, there was a huge open space. 2 figures were facing each other with a few hundred meters between them. There were countless people watching from a few thousand meters away. The king of sword heroes from the eastern sword region, sword hero Chumu, versus the number 1 Chi High warrior from the central sword region, Thousand River Mansion, Sky River County, windless sword Lingwufeng. Bring out your sword, let me see the elegance of the king of sword region. Lingwufeng looked very young, as if he was only 30 years old. He was very handsome, with one hand behind his back and the other holding a sword. His body was straight like a peerless sword, and his eyes were sharp. Chumu did not say anything. He moved his right hand and a blurry sword light shot out. Lingwufeng's expression changed slightly as he quickly retreated. At the same time, he pulled out his sword and stabbed out. The sword light pierced through the air. With Lingwufeng's first attack, Chumu realized that when he stabbed out, there was no way to block it. It was as if no matter how hard he tried to block it, there would be a gap, and Lingwufeng's sword would pierce through that gap. Chumu turned his wrist, and the monster-slaying sword shook slightly, immediately pushing Lingwufeng's sword away. Lingwufeng used the force to push down, and the tip of his sword shot out a terrifying light, cutting towards Chumu's leg. Both of them fought with speed, and as their swords clashed, Lingwufeng's sword seemed to be able to pierce through every hole. Every sword was able to find a gap, and this made Chumu very surprised. Could this be the windless sword Dao? Chumu guessed as he was surprised. One of the reasons why he challenged Lingwufeng was to see the windless sword Dao, windless sword Dao. Windless sword Dao. Lingwufeng was even more shocked. Ever since he had inherited the windless sword art, none of the Chi High swordsmen he had met were his match. Even some of the stronger sword heroes were not his match. The windless sword Dao was actually wind everywhere. As the saying goes, there is no wall in the world that does not have a crack. Facing his windless sword Dao, no matter how perfect the defense was, it was useless. He could immediately find a gap and attack from there. When he fought with Chumu, it was true that he could find a gap in every sword. Unfortunately, every sword that attacked the gap was blocked by Chumu. Furthermore, Chumu's sword art seemed ordinary, but it contained everything, causing his attacks to be useless. Even if he increased the speed of his sword, it would still be blocked by Chumu. It was so easy. After 100 swords, Lingwufeng knew that his windless sword Dao could not do anything to Chumu. He slashed out with his sword, and it was like a raging storm, causing sand and stones to fly, forcing Chumu to retreat. His wrist turned, and the storm wrapped around his body like a dragon. After one round, it suddenly increased in size and turned into a dragon that was 10 feet long. He stabbed out with his sword, and the 14% sword intent condensed into the storm dragon. It let out a Zhen Tian roar, and the rumbling sound resonated in the surroundings. Sand and stones flew everywhere, and the air trembled. It was like the end of the world. Moon beheading! With a low roar, Lingwufeng raised the monster beheading sword and slashed down again. Under the moon beheading sword with the 12% sword intent, a few meters long dark golden crescent moon shot out. With a poochie sound, the 30 feet long storm dragon was struck by the dark golden crescent moon. With a miserable roar, the storm dragon was cut in half, and the remaining 1/3 of the dark golden crescent moon slashed towards Lingwufeng. Lingwufeng was shocked. He immediately waved his sword, and the storm howled again, wrapping around his body. The moon beheading sword slashed down, and the storm was shattered. The dark golden crescent moon was shattered, and a huge impact sent Ling Wufeng flying. His chest felt stuffy, and blood leaked out from the corner of his mouth. Sheathing his sword, Chu Mu glanced at Ling Wufeng, turned around and left. Wait! Ling Wufeng covered his chest with one hand and yelled at Chu Mu, "Was that your full power? You are not worthy of my full power." Chu Mu did not even turn his head, and his footsteps did not stop. He only left behind a sentence, and it spread with the wind into everyone's ears. Ling Wufeng's face blushed, and his eyes were filled with anger. He stared at Chu Mu, as if he wanted to imprint Chu Mu's figure into his mind. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 484. One of the 3 prefectures adjacent to the Thousand River Prefecture was the West City Prefecture. The Qing clan was the number 1 family in the West City Prefecture. Yuan Chuan, this is your mistake. According to the Qing clan's rules, you should be punished with 10,000 swords piercing through your body. However, you have been loyal to the clan for many years. Even if you have not made any contributions, you have worked hard. I will make an exception and give you a chance to capture that little bastard alive and redeem yourself. The Qing clan's master was furious. A terrifying sword pressure swept out and filled the surroundings. Everything seemed to be frozen. Even the air was about to turn into nothingness. The middle-aged sword guard kneeling below was pale. Cold sweat dripped down from his forehead. He was extremely terrified. Yuanji Deshang's cultivation base did not even have a chance to resist under such sword pressure. Just this sword pressure alone was enough to suffocate him to death. Go! The Qing clan's master withdrew that terrifying sword pressure and said coldly, "Yes, master. I swear on my life that I will definitely capture that damned little bastard alive and let the young master get rid of his inner demon." Qing Yuanchuan said. He stood up, turned around, and strode away. Damn thing. I didn't expect you to dare to enter the central main sword region. You even dared to challenge others along the way. Just as well. It saves me the trouble of investigating your whereabouts. Qing Yuanchuan soared into the sky and quickly left the Qing clan. He was secretly furious. His eyes flickered with killing intent. He was the bodyguard of the Wild Wave sword hero, Qing Tianlan. Qing Tianlan was too arrogant. In the end, she was defeated by Chu Mu in one strike at the East Sword region's Tongming River harbor, leaving behind an inner demon. Originally, he wanted to kill Chu Mu directly and help Qing Tianlan get rid of the inner demon. However, he was stopped by the 6 primary realm swordsmen from the East Sword region and lost his chance. After bringing Qing Tianlan back to the Qing clan, he would definitely be punished. If it wasn't for his loyalty over the years, he would have been executed by the Qing clan for negligence of duty. Now, he had a chance to redeem himself by capturing Chu Mu alive. If possible, Qing Yuanchuan wanted to kill Chu Mu even more. However, he dared not disobey the orders of the family head. He wanted to capture Chu Mu alive and bring him back to the Qing family, severely injure him, and then let the young master, Qing Tianlan, kill him with his own hands. This way, the devil in the young master's heart could be removed. The reason why they didn't bring anyone else was because both the head of the Qing clan and Qing Yuanchuan believed that no matter how powerful a sword hero was, he would not be a match for a swordsman of the origin realm like Deshang. He would be killed in one strike. Yuanji Deshang's speed was extremely fast. In addition to Qing Yuanchuan's hatred for Chu Mu, he couldn't wait to appear in front of Chu Mu, injure him severely, and bring him back to the Qing family to complete his mission and make up for his mistakes. Number 1 in the Qianchuan prefecture. Chu Mu had a faint smile on his face. His body moved and leaped, traversing through the forest. His speed was extremely fast, like a flash of light, traveling 100 meters in an instant. Just as the slight sound of the wind breaking was heard, the moon-white figure had already appeared more than 100 meters away. He quickly disappeared, leaving behind only wisps of wind. After defeating Ling Wufeng in the Tianhe County, Chu Mu stepped into the next county and continued to challenge. Following the challenges, his reputation grew more and more resounding. In fact, the moment Chu Mu entered the next county, before he even issued a challenge, someone immediately issued a challenge to him. The result was naturally that person being defeated by Chu Mu in one strike. Until now, Chu Mu had fought dozens of battles. In every battle, he would first engage in a fierce battle with his opponent's sword techniques. He would clearly see his opponent's characteristics, absorb their strengths, and then defeat his opponent with one strike using less energy. The current Chu Mu was like a huge sponge, constantly absorbing everything that he could absorb and then quickly transforming it into his own ability. This allowed him to constantly improve and improve in all aspects. Sword techniques, sword skills. Compared to the current Chu Mu before entering the central main sword region, there was an obvious difference in his strength. Even if he used the same amount of strength, Chu Mu was confident that he could defeat his previous self within 10 strikes. His improvement was very obvious. Half a day ago, Chu Mu had defeated the #1 Qi High warrior in the Qianchuan prefecture. This person was indeed very powerful. He had actually comprehended 19% of the sword intent, and had inherited the mountain sword Dao. Every strike of his contained the power of the mountains, and was extremely powerful. When he waved his sword, the air around him would be suppressed, as if a mountain was descending. When the swordsmen who were not as strong as him faced his sword, they would feel like they were being suppressed, unable to move their limbs, and would be easily defeated. But Chu Mu was stronger than him. In the intense battle of sword techniques, Chu Mu fully understood the essence of mountain sword Dao. He could feel the pressure of mountains pressing down on him from all directions. Illusions of mountains condensed around him, as if they were about to crush his body. The power of the sky desolate sword body was displayed once again. Chu Mu's sword techniques actually had a breakthrough under this pressure, and he had also absorbed a trace of the essence, making his sword techniques even more powerful. In the end, he still used the moon-slashing blade to defeat his opponent's ultimate move. He did not kill his opponent, because this was a challenge, not a battle to the death. After defeating his opponent, the #1 Qi High warrior in the Qianchuan prefecture was naturally Chu Mu. His reputation was even greater, and in a short period of time, almost all the swordsmen in the Qianchuan prefecture knew of his existence. Thus, many families sent out people in an attempt to invite Chu Mu to become their family's guest. Passing through the forest, Chu Mu officially left the Qianchuan prefecture and entered the Xiqing prefecture. The Pingyang prefecture belonged to the Xiqing prefecture, and Chu Mu's first destination was the Li family of the Pingyang prefecture. First, he had to complete the task entrusted to him by the headmaster of the sword mansion, Li Daoyuan. Then, he continued to head west towards the Heavenly Sword Pagoda. After running madly all the way into the Xiqing prefecture, Chu Mu stopped to rest for a moment. Suddenly, he raised his head to look at the sky. His brows furrowed slightly, and he vaguely felt uneasy. After 3 breaths, a black shadow suddenly appeared in the sky. It rapidly approached, and in the blink of an eye, a blurry figure appeared. In the next breath, the blurry figure became clear, and in the next breath, Chu Mu could already see his opponent's face. "It's him." Slightly startled, Chu Mu's face became serious, but he did not leave. This was because Chu Mu knew that with his speed, it was impossible for him to escape from an Origin Realm swordsman Deshang. The Origin Deshang swordsman's speed was too fast. Even if he did not use any secret techniques to increase his speed, he was still 10 times faster than Chu Mu. Taking a deep breath, Chu Mu felt the meteor sword energy that was emitting a terrifying wave in his spiritual world. Perhaps this time, he had no choice but to use this meteor sword energy. He really did not know how much of it would be consumed after using it. A majestic aura that was as heavy as a mountain descended from the sky, crushing down. The surrounding rocks and plants creaked as if they could not bear the weight. Chu Mu only felt this terrifying aura crushing down on his body. His blood almost stopped flowing, and his bones felt like they were about to shatter. Clenching his teeth, his body stood straight, unyielding. The ground beneath his feet shattered, and his feet sank into the ground. In a flash, Ching Yuanchuan appeared a few dozen meters above Chu Mu. He looked down at Chu Mu with a mocking expression. "You actually did not escape. It seems like you know your place. You know that with your strength, you have no chance of escaping from me," Ching Yuanchuan said with a cold face. Ching Yuanchuan's face was gloomy as he spoke. Seeing Chu Mu, he remembered the punishment he almost had to endure. His hair stood on end and his anger burned high. "Against you, I don't need to escape," Chu Mu coldly replied as he resisted the other party's aura. He felt his bones and muscles trembling. With the meteor sword energy as his trump card, Chu Mu was naturally not afraid of the other party. Moreover, maybe the Azura sword of Gojoseon in the dark red sword hanging around his neck would not just stand by and watch. After all, he needed Chu Mu to send it back to the Azura sword sect. However, Chu Mu was not willing to let others interfere in matters that could be solved by himself. Moreover, Chu Mu always had a thought in his heart, and that was to test the power of the meteor sword energy. Ever since he obtained the meteor sword energy, he was very curious. He wanted to see how powerful the meteor sword energy was. However, Chu Mu was not stupid enough to waste the power of the meteor sword energy. But in this situation, he had no choice but to use it. It also satisfied the curiosity in his heart. "Is that so? You are very confident, and I am also willing to believe that once you break through to the origin realm, I might not be your opponent. Unfortunately, you are just an ant in my eyes right now. No matter how strong you are still an ant in the end. You are a weak existence that I can crush with a single finger." Ching Yuanchuan's face was a little ferocious as he stretched out his finger and twisted it. Chu Mu did not answer. He focused his mind and began to mobilize the meteor sword energy in his spiritual world. Fortunately, the mobilization of the meteor sword energy only required one to concentrate. Otherwise, he would not be able to fight back under the pressure of the other party's sword. The meteor sword energy that contained a terrifying power trembled, just as it was about to release an earth-shattering power. "Let me deal with him." A faint voice sounded in Chu Mu's ears. Immediately, before Chu Mu could react, the dark red sword under his robe flew out automatically. With a flash of light, a shadow emerged from the sword and condensed above. With a stretch of his hand, the dark red sword enlarged and fell into his hand. The Shura sword of Gojoseon reappeared. Ching Yuanchuan's eyes widened as he looked at the Shura sword of Gojoseon that suddenly appeared. The huge sword pressure instantly disappeared without a trace, like smoke blown away by the wind. It could no longer exert any pressure on Chu Mu. Who are you?" Ching Yuanchuan said with difficulty. From the Shura sword of Gojoseon, he felt something that made his hair stand on end. It was unimaginable. Even when he faced the head of the Qing family, he did not have such a terrifying feeling. Could it be that the person who suddenly appeared in front of him was an existence even stronger than the head of the Qing family? Unfortunately, the Shura sword of Gojoseon did not say a word. He did not even look at Ching Yuanchuan. He just waved his sword casually. With that sword, the sky turned blood-red. This was the last color that Ching Yuanchuan saw in this world. With a splat, Ching Yuanchuan was cut in half by the Shura sword of Gojoseon. The two halves of his body fell to the left and right. Blood poured down like a torrential rain, reflecting the sky in Chu Mu's eyes. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 485. Back in the day, when the Shura sword of Gojoseon made its first move, it instantly killed an Origin Realm sword artist. Today, the Shura sword of Gojoseon made its move again, and again, it instantly killed an Origin Realm sword artist Deshang. The power of the sword of Gojoseon was unparalleled. Chumu also noticed that after the Shura sword of Gojoseon killed Qing Yuanchuan, its body seemed to have faded a little. "Thank you, Senior Sword of Gojoseon." Chumu saluted with his sword and said. Although he hadn't seen the power of the meteor sword energy, the fact that the Shura sword of Gojoseon took the initiative to attack had saved him a lot of energy. No need to be so polite. The Shura sword of Gojoseon turned around to look at Chumu and said calmly, "I still need you to send me back to the Shura sword sect. Naturally, I have to protect you." "Don't worry, Senior Sword of Gojoseon. I will hurry to the Shura sword sect as soon as possible," Chumu said with a serious face. "Go and collect the Origin Realm sword artist's space bracelet. We'll talk later." The Shura sword of Gojoseon nodded and turned into a mist and entered the Shura sword. The Shura sword shrunk back to its original dark red shape and flew up by itself, hanging on Chumu's neck. Chumu's figure flashed and appeared next to Qing Yuanchuan's corpse. He put away Qing Yuanchuan's royal-grade sword and extreme-grade spatial bracer, then set the corpse on fire and used sky-traversing secret technique to quickly leave. At night, the moon was bright and the stars were sparse, shining down on the land. Everything was covered in a layer of silver gauze. In a corner of a valley there was a flickering fire. A figure was sitting beside the bonfire, using a branch to stir the firewood from time to time. Chumu had already checked Qing Yuanchuan's supreme-grade spatial bracelet. There were a lot of spirit stones, even a few hundred supreme-grade spirit stones. Their value was extraordinary. Other than that, there were also pills, spirit herbs, ores, and so on. Qing Yuanchuan's collection was even richer than Venerable Yin snakes. It took Chumu some time to classify them and rearrange them. Then, this top-grade space bracelet and Master Yin Snake's top-grade space bracelet became Chumu's main space bracelet. In terms of wealth, the current Chumu was several times richer than an ordinary astral realm swordsman. Unfortunately, this wasn't of much use to him. Fortunately, the abundant amount of spiritual stones he had could be used to purchase useful items from other swordsmen or shop. Popping sounds could be heard from the blazing bonfire, and from time to time, wisps of sparks would fly out. "Your talent is not bad." Suddenly, a voice sounded. It was neither cold nor hot, neither high nor low. It was very calm. Chumu was startled for a moment before he realized that it was the voice of the Azura sword of Gojoseon. Previously, the Azura sword of Gojoseon had said that they would talk later, but he hadn't appeared since. Chumu also didn't want to disturb him. Chumu didn't expect him to take the initiative to talk now. Sweeping his gaze, he didn't see the Azura sword of Gojoseon's figure. "There's no need to look. I can talk to you without appearing." The Azura sword of Gojoseon's voice sounded again. Chumu wasn't good with words. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The atmosphere was silent. "Since I woke up, I have been observing you. Your talent, your willpower, your temperament, everything is good. It's hard to imagine that someone like you would be born in such a remote place in the Eastern Sword domain." The Azura sword of Gojoseon broke the silence and spoke again. "A flourishing age doesn't necessarily produce heroes," Chumu replied. He had enough respect for the Azura sword of Gojoseon. However, his personality was like this. He wouldn't bow and scrape, nor would he flatter. "I see that you are improving with every battle. You are the second person I have seen who has such a strong talent for battle and was born for the sword." The Azura sword of Gojoseon spoke again. His calm tone became somewhat leisurely, as if he was recalling something. He fell silent. Chumu really wanted to ask, who was the first person? However, this silence made him unable to open his mouth. Therefore, he could only wait. After a moment, the Azura sword of Gojoseon's voice sounded again. "Are you willing to enter my Azura sword sect?" The Azura sword of Gojoseon's thoughts jumped and said something that stunned Chu Mu. You don't have to answer me now. You have enough time to think about it. Give me your answer when you send me to the Azura sword sect. Before Chu Mu could answer, the Azura sword of Gojoseon spoke again. His words made Chu Mu subconsciously heave a sigh of relief. There was no doubt that the Azura sword sect was one of the sword Dao sects in the central main sword domain. There was no need to doubt its strength and deep foundation. Chu Mu, who had been in the central main sword domain for a few months, was not a rookie who didn't know anything. He already knew that there were many sects in the central main sword domain, at least thousands of them. However, there were only 10 sects that could be called sword Dao sect. There were 5 orthodox sword sects and 5 evil sword sects. The Azura sword sect belonged to the evil sword sects. Since ancient times, there were differences between good and evil. Although it wasn't to the extent of killing each other, once they knew each other's camp, they would most likely fight to determine victory or defeat or even life and death. Once Chu Mu entered the Azura sword sect, he would be labeled as an evil swordsman. Regardless of whether Chu Mu was willing to admit it or not, regardless of whether he paid attention to it or not, in short, a portion of the orthodox swordsmen would chase after him and even cause unnecessary trouble. Chu Mu wasn't afraid of trouble, but he didn't like trouble for no reason. This was one of the reasons why he didn't immediately answer the Azura sword of Gojoseon, but it wasn't the main point. The second reason was the main point. It was because Chu Mu hadn't decided whether to travel around as an independent swordsman to gain experience or enter a sword sect to cultivate. 2 different choices would lead to 2 different paths. Perhaps they would end up in the same place, but the process would be different. Chu Mu needed some time to think carefully. After all, it was related to his future. Not everyone was suitable to enter a sword sect, and not everyone was suitable to be an independent swordsman. The central main sword domain was different from the eastern main sword domain. In the eastern main sword domain, it was often difficult for independent swordsmen to stand out. However, in the central main sword domain, the land was vast and there were many fortuitous encounters. Perhaps with luck, an independent swordsman could also encounter fortuitous encounters and obtain the inheritance of a senior expert. From then on, he would have extraordinary strength and a meteoric rise in fame. In the central main sword domain, there weren't many examples like this, but it wasn't as rare as in the eastern main sword domain. Of course, on the whole, the future of an independent swordsman was indeed not as good as that of a sword sect disciple. Do you know why there are thousands of sword sects in the central main sword domain, but only 10 sects have become sword sects? The Azura sword of Gojoseon asked. Senior, please enlighten me, Chu Mu said. The so-called sword sect is a sword sect that can pass down the sword Dao, unlike some relics left by predecessors that can only be inherited by one person. The Azura sword of Gojoseon said slowly. In addition, the sword Dao passed down by the 10 sword sects are all Mahayana sword Dao. Mahayana sword Dao? Chu Mu frowned slightly. He knew about sword Dao, but he didn't understand Mahayana sword Dao. At least, there were no records of this in the ancient books he had read. It was also the first time he had heard of it. Sword Dao is different from Mahayana sword Dao. The Azura sword of Gojoseon's tone changed again, becoming distant and unfathomable. You have seen a lot of Mahayana sword Dao, and you have also personally fought with the inheritors of Mahayana sword Dao. Senior, you mean? Chu Mu couldn't help but think of the swordsmen who had inherited sword Dao that he had fought with. 7 Kill sword Dao, True Aura sword Dao, Windless sword Dao, Mountain sword Dao, and various other sword Daos. Were they all so-called Mahayana sword Daos? Yes, whether it is Windless sword Dao or Mountain sword Dao, they are all Mahayana sword Daos. May I ask, Senior Sword of Gojoseon, what is the difference between Mahayana sword Dao and Mahayana sword Dao? Chu Mu asked seriously. I can't explain the mysteries between Mahayana and Mahayana Sword Tao because I haven't comprehended it yet. The Asura sword of Gojoseon said bluntly, but Mahayana Sword Tao and Mahayana Sword Tao are just like sword momentum and sword intent. There is a huge difference in power. In addition, Mahayana Sword Tao can only stop at Sword Venerable, while Mahayana Sword Tao can have hope of reaching Sword Saint. With that said, the Asura sword of Gojoseon paused to give Chu Mu some time to digest. The meaning contained in those few short sentences was very shocking. Mahayana Sword Tao can only stop at Sword Venerable, while Mahayana Sword Tao can have hope of reaching Sword Saint. Those words echoed in Chu Mu's mind. If you want to become a sword of Gojoseon, you have to obtain the Mahayana Sword Tao inheritance, the Asura sword of Gojoseon added. Senior sword of Gojoseon, if I obtain the Mahayana Sword Tao inheritance, can I still become a sword of Gojoseon? Chu Mu asked subconsciously. The Mahayana Sword Tao originates from the Mahayana Sword Tao and can be said to be a branch of the Mahayana Sword Tao. As long as you obtain the Mahayana Sword Tao inheritance, you can replace the Mahayana Sword Tao. However, if the Mahayana Sword Tao is of the same origin, the Mahayana Sword Tao will devour the Mahayana Sword Tao. If the Mahayana Sword Tao is of different origin, the Mahayana Sword Tao will disperse the Mahayana Sword Tao. The Asura sword of Gojoseon explained to Chu Mu. For example, the Asura sword sect of the Asura sword sect is a Mahayana Sword Tao. There are various branches under it, such as the Seven Kills Sword Tao and the Lifeless Sword Tao. Because the Asura Sword Tao focuses on killing, the Mahayana Sword Tao that doesn't have a clear bias can be reluctantly included in the Asura Sword Tao. Senior, has anyone created their own Sword Tao? Chu Mu asked again. As far as I know, the Mahayana Sword Tao has been passed down since ancient times. I have never heard of a Mahayana Sword Tao being artificially created. The Sword Tao created by powerful swordsmen is usually created after they have mastered the Mahayana Sword Tao that they have inherited to a certain extent. They then take part of the essence and create a Mahayana Sword Tao to pass down. The Asura sword of Gojoseon replied, "There has been a saying in the central main sword domain since ancient times. Whoever can create a Mahayana Sword Tao has a glimmer of hope of becoming a sword god." 10,000 years ago, there was an extremely talented person who gave up on all Sword Tao inheritances and was determined to create a Mahayana Sword Tao. He used 1,000 years to challenge and familiarize himself with hundreds of Sword Taos. He then went into seclusion for 100 years and created the myriad Sword Tao. Unfortunately, it was flawed and was only a hair's breadth away from the Mahayana Sword Tao. He couldn't perfect it no matter what he did. After creating the Myriad Sword sect, he died of depression. However, the Myriad Sword Tao that he created was hailed as the #1 Sword Tao below the Mahayana Sword Tao. Chu Mu listened quietly. His heart was in turmoil as a shocking thought quietly grew in his mind. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 486. That night, Chu Mu and the Asura sword of Gojoseon chatted for a long time, and their understanding of the way of the sword deepened. After that, Chu Mu no longer challenged swordsmen. Instead, he pondered as he traveled. When he stopped to rest, he would ask the Asura sword of Gojoseon for guidance, and his understanding of the way of the sword deepened. Chu Mu had a powerful soul, which gave him an eidetic memory and monstrous perception. The Asura sword of Gojoseon was an ancient sword of Gojoseon. He came from the Asura sword sect, one of the top 10 sword sections. He had a deep foundation, and his knowledge and experience far exceeded that of the average sword of Gojoseon. After 2 months of patient guidance, Chu Mu's understanding of the way of the sword had already surpassed many venerables. Only those with deep foundations or powerful backgrounds could compare. Chu Mu was very grateful for the Azura sword of Gojoseon's generous guidance, but he did not say it out loud. He was sure that whether he inherited a Mahayana sword art or created his own in the future, the Azura sword of Gojoseon's guidance had built a solid foundation for him. After arriving at Pingyang County, he did a bit of investigation and discovered that there was no Li clan in Pingyang County. After asking around, Chu Mu finally found out that the Li clan had already moved out of Pingyang County a few decades ago and their whereabouts were unknown. Looks like I won't be able to complete the prefecture lord's request for the time being, Chu Mu muttered with a frown. Without knowing the whereabouts of the Li clan, Chu Mu could only put the matter aside for the time being. The central sword domain was so big that finding the whereabouts of the Li clan was like finding a needle in a haystack. It was impossible. I can only rely on luck, Chu Mu muttered to himself, and once again set off for the Heavenly Sword Tower. Investigate, investigate, investigate. The Qing clan head roared. The entire hall was filled with terrifying sword pressure. Although the Qing family was an aristocratic family with a deep foundation, Origin Realm swordsmen were not as common as cabbages, especially those who had reached Deshang's level of cultivation. Every one of them was very important. Therefore, every primary realm swordsman and important disciple of the Qing clan had a mental seal that was closely related to their spirit. When Cheng Yuanchuan was instantly killed by the Azura sword of Gojoseon, the mental seal instantly shattered and was immediately reported to the Qing clan head by the deacon. Unfortunately, the Qing family's search for Chu Mu's whereabouts was fruitless. Because Chu Mu was immersed in absorbing and accumulating sword knowledge, there were many young swordsmen wearing moon-white robes in the huge West City prefecture. Chu Mu was also traveling at a fast speed and did not have any contact with others. It was very difficult to find him. By the time the Qing clan received news of Chu Mu's whereabouts, Chu Mu had already left the Western City prefecture. Mount Tongtian was not very tall. It was only 300 meters tall. Among the mountains in the central sword domain, it was considered below average in height. However, it was extremely famous because the famous Heavenly Sword Pagoda was located at Mount Tongtian. The Sky Pass Sword Tower was a place where many swordsmen gathered. Here, one could see rare genius swordsmen, like cabbages in a street stall. Because there were many swordsmen who came to challenge the Sky Pass Mountain, a certain scale of gathering place was formed at the bottom of Sky Pass Mountain. It developed into a bustling town. This town was called Sky Pass Town. Because of the Sky Pass Sword Tower, Sky Pass Town was also very famous in the central main sword region. Sky Pass Town was a chaotic place with all kinds of people. It was a lawless area. Here, as long as one had enough strength, they could do whatever they wanted. When Chu Mu arrived at Sky Pass Town, it was already sunset. However, he did not stop. Using the third level of the Flying Swan illusory steps, his body became illusory. Some of the stronger Qi high swordsmen even thought that their eyes were playing tricks on them. 3,000 meters was not high for Chu Mu. In just a short while, Chu Mu arrived at the top of Sky Pass Mountain. The first thing he saw was a very tall pagoda. The pagoda was like a sword. It was pitch black, deep, and mysterious. It was simple and unadorned, but there was an incomparably sharp aura around it. It was like an incomparably huge sword that stood at the top of Sky Pass Mountain, pointing to the sky. Its aura was as if it wanted to pierce through the sky of the central main sword region. The sword pagoda reached the sky. It had 99 levels. Including the top, it was 999 meters tall. It stood in the dark night like an ancient sword. As the clamor entered his ears, Chu Mu seemed to have been awakened. Sweeping his eyes over the area, heavenly connecting peaks seemed to have been flattened by a sword. Other than the heavenly connecting sword tower in the center that took up an area of 500 meters, there were also 3 black sword steels that were 100 meters tall. The 3 black sword steels were scattered around the Sky Pass sword pagoda, forming a triangle. It made people feel that the three black sword steels had a slight connection with the Sky Pass Sword Pagoda, as if they were a derivative of the Sky Pass Sword Pagoda. In front of the three black sword steels, there was a group of people who were pointing at them. Among them, one of the black sword steels had the most people. It was at least 10 times more than the other two sword steels. Because there were so many people gathered here, it was as bright as day. However, Chu-Mu realized that the Black Sky Pass Sword Pagoda and the three black sword steels were like black holes that absorbed all the light. It was an absolute darkness that made people tremble in fear. Chu-Mu's arrival did not cause any commotion. A few people glanced at him and did not care at all. "Hey, brother, do you want a jar of wine? The wine in my shop has been aged for 30 years. It's delicious." As Chu-Mu walked forward, someone yelled from the side. When Chu-Mu turned around to look, he discovered a fatty beaming with joy as he held a jug of wine in each hand. It had to be said that this was indeed a good place to do business. Besides wine, there was also barbecued meat and other food. However, Chu-Mu was not hungry. He skipped it and walked towards one of the black sword steels. It was the one with the most people. Heavenly Sword Hero Rankings. These 5 words were at the top of the black sword steels. They were gold in color and shone with golden light, as if they were constantly emitting a faint light. This is the Heavenly Sword Hero Rankings. Then the other 2 sword steels should be the Heavenly Sword Hero Rankings and the Heavenly Sword of Gojosian Rankings. Chu-Mu thought to himself. He stood outside the crowd, his eyes flashing. Starting from the top of the Heavenly Sword Hero Rankings, his gaze slowly moved down. The first place was naturally the first place of the Heavenly Sword Hero Rankings. The golden words shone brightly. Zhu Wudao, Heavenly Sword Hero, 3 years, level 30. The first part was the name and title of Sword Master, while the last part represented that he had been ranked first on the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking for 3 years. The last 30 levels indicated that Absolute Wudao's highest record in the Heavenly Sword Tower was 30 levels. Zhu Wudao. Chu-Mu said the name in a voice that only he could hear. He was very shocked. There were many genius swordsmen in the central main sword region. In the eastern main sword region, it was very impressive to become a sword hero at the age of 20. In 1,000 years there would not be more than 10. But in the central main sword region, although becoming a sword hero at the age of 20 was not as common as cabbages, there were still many. It was at least 100 times more common than in the eastern main sword region. There were even some who became sword heroes before the age of 20, such as at the age of 19 or 18. The earlier one became a sword hero, the better their talent. Basically, a swordsman who became a sword hero at the age of 20 had a 100% chance of becoming a sword venerable. Even if they did not receive the legacy of the Mahayana way of the sword, they still had a high chance of becoming the sword of Gojosian. In the central main sword region, where there were so many genius swordsmen, Zhu Wudao had actually been first on the Heavenly Sword Hero rankings for 3 years. This was enough to prove his strength. In that moment, Chu-Mu was very interested in this Zhu Wudao. He glanced to the side and found someone to ask. Zhu Wudao, he is a monster in our central main sword region. The person that Chu-Mu asked sighed. Following which, he started talking non-stop. His eyebrows were raised and his face was flushed red. He was clearly a loyal fan of Zhu Wudao. Chu-Mu listened quietly and memorized Zhu Wudao's information. Zhu Wudao, the last disciple of the leader of the Royal Extreme Sword Sect. He became a sword hero at the age of 19 and was 25 this year. He did not inherit the Royal Extreme Sword Way of the Royal Extreme Sword Sect, but the Heavenless Sword Way that was not inferior to the Royal Extreme Sword Way of the Royal Extreme Sword Way. It was rumored that Zhu Wudao had comprehended 2 wills, the metal will and the water will. Furthermore, he could fuse the metal and water wills, increasing his strength tremendously. It was very frightening. Furthermore, he had already comprehended the sword will to 25%. His attack power was extremely shocking. With all these factors combined, he was known as the king of the sword heroes in the central main sword region. He was invincible and had occupied the throne of first on the Heavenly Sword Hero rankings for 3 years. The metal and water have already fused. Chu Mu frowned slightly. Back when he was in the Great Kuan Sword residence, he had heard that different wills could fuse and explode with extraordinary strength. It was very frightening. However, Chu Mu's wills mutated and he lost the chance to fuse the wills. However, among all the opponents he had met, at least none of them could fuse the wills. From this point, one could see how difficult it was to fuse the wills. For this, Chu Mu had flipped through many ancient books and finally obtained the answer during the 2 years he spent in the Eastern Sage Sub-Hall. The level of the power of the wills was too low. The level of the swordsman who had comprehended the wills was too low as well. The strength of the soul was not enough, and it was impossible to fuse the 2 wills. Furthermore, to fuse the different wills, one had to have the power of the wills that were similar to each other. Of course, it was theoretically possible for wills that were completely unrelated or opposed to each other to be fused. However, the difficulty was much higher and was equivalent to impossible. For example, the metal will and the water will. Among the 5 elements, metal gave birth to water and the 2 could be fused. However, if it was metal and wood, it would be extremely difficult. Or if it was water and fire, the difficulty would be even higher. However, once the wills were promoted to ultimacy, the difficulty of fusing them would be much lower. It was even possible to fuse the opposing ultimacies. No matter what, the power of the fusion of the metal and water wills would definitely exceed his own lacerating will by a lot. Sword intent 25%. Chu Mu was extremely shocked because his current sword intent had only reached 20%. If he wanted to increase his sword intent further, it would be too difficult. Absolute Tao. Chu Mu muttered to himself. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 487. Other than the first-ranked Zhu Wudao, the second was Yan Jiu. He had also become a sword hero at the age of 19. He was 26 years old this year, and was a disciple of the Yellow Springs sword sect. He had inherited the Yellow Springs sword way and had comprehended the 2 intents of wind and cloud. He could also merge the intents of wind and cloud. Yan Jiu's highest record was the 30th level of the Heavenly Sword Tower. However, he might have lasted a little less than Zhu Wudao, so he was ranked second. He had occupied the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking for 2 years. The third-ranked sword hero was Gu Jianghe. He was 28 years old and had inherited the Mountain River Sword Way. He had comprehended the mountain intent of earth and the sea intent of water. The mountain intent and the sea intent were mid-level mutated intent. Their power exceeded the normal intents by 20%. Once they merged, the power would be terrifying. However, Gu Jianghe had not achieved this. The difficulty of merging a mutated intent was more than 10 times that of a normal intent. Gu Jianghe could not do it with his ability. Other than the 2 mutated intents, Gu Jianghe's sword intent had also reached the level of 23%. He had been ranked 3rd on the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking for a year and a half. His highest record was the 29th level of the Heavenly Sword Tower. Most importantly, Gu Jianghe was a scattered swordsman. Chu Mu could not help but shake his head and smile bitterly. The central main sword domain was indeed the main sword domain. The strength of the top 3 sword heroes on the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking was above his. And in terms of age, Zhu Wudao was the same age as him. The other 2 were only 1 or 2 years older than him. I want to stand at the peak of the sword heroes in the central main sword domain, and then break through the Qi-Si realm and enter the 9th transformation realm. Chu Mu clenched his fist and said to himself. His blood was boiling. His sword intent that had not broken through for a long time was now showing signs of breaking through to 22%. Indeed, coming to the central main sword domain was the right choice. Chu Mu took a deep breath. Even though his heart was filled with pride, he knew that his current strength was far from enough. Compared to the top 3 on the Heavenly Sword hero ranking, he still had a clear gap, especially when compared to Zhu Wudao. He scanned the other names on the Heavenly Sword ranking. 4th, 5th, 6th. Suddenly, Chu Mu's eyes widened in shock. He stared unblinkingly at the 8th place on the Heavenly Sword hero rankings, thinking that he was hallucinating. Xiao Qianfeng, Lifeless Sword Hero, 3 months, 26th level. Senior Brother Xiao. A wave of excitement surged in Chu Mu's heart, and a wisp of uncontrollable joy appeared on his face. He knew that Xiao Qianfeng should be in the Central Primary Sword domain, but the Central Primary Sword domain was extremely large, and finding Xiao Qianfeng was no different from finding a needle in a haystack. Who would have thought that he would actually see Xiao Qianfeng's name on the Heavenly Sword proclamation? He had occupied the 8th position for 3 months, which meant that Xiao Qianfeng had come here 3 months ago and challenged the Heavenly Sword Tower. Based on this situation, Xiao Qianfeng should be coming to challenge the Heavenly Sword Tower again. Are you familiar with the 8th place? Chu Mu asked the tyrannical fan. 8th place, Xiao Qianfeng. I heard that this person is from the Eastern Sword domain. He is a typical enigma and a battle maniac. His battle talent is outstanding, and he can often defeat stronger opponents. He likes to challenge people everywhere, and has offended many people. This person pondered for a moment and said, "A year ago, he started challenging the Heavenly Sword Tower and entered the Heavenly Sword proclamation on his first try. This kind of situation is rare. The second time, he entered the top 30. 3 months ago, it was his 3rd attempt at the Heavenly Sword Tower, and he actually rose to 8th place. Rumor has it that this Xiao Qianfeng obtained the legacy of the lifeless sword Dao and comprehended the extremely rare concept of killing. His sword will has also reached 18%, this person said. Chu Mu nodded, but at the same time, he was puzzled. Senior Brother Xiao obtained the legacy of the lifeless sword Dao? Didn't he obtain the boundless sword Dao? Chu Mu clearly remembered that Xiao Qianfeng had used the boundless sword Dao in their battle at the Green Edge Sword sect. He had said it himself. Now, it was said to be the lifeless sword Dao, and the title of sword hero was the lifeless sword Dao. It had nothing to do with the boundless sword Dao. If he couldn't figure it out, he could only wait until he met Xiao Qianfeng. Unknowingly, Chu Mu was looking forward to meeting Xiao Qianfeng again. In his impression, Xiao Qianfeng was indeed a battle maniac. His battle talent was outstanding, but he was buried in a small place like the Green Edge Sword sect. Once he left the Green Edge Sword sect and entered the central main sword region, he was like a dragon returning to the sea. Xiao Qianfeng was the kind of genius who was good at fighting. This kind of person usually had the ability to defeat someone stronger than him. Of course, if the difference in strength was too big, it would be a joke for the weak to defeat the strong. However, if the difference wasn't too big, it was definitely possible for the weak to defeat the strong. But I heard that this Xiao Qianfeng is in trouble now, this person suddenly added. Trouble? What trouble? A dark golden color flashed across Chu Mu's eyes, and a trace of powerful aura instantly burst out and then retracted. However, this caused the person who spoke to break out in cold sweat. The way he looked at Chu Mu changed greatly, and there was a trace of reverence and fear. Speak. Chu Mu shouted in a low voice. I'll speak. I'll speak. This person sorted out his thoughts and hurriedly explained, I heard this news from someone else. A month ago, the young master of the heaven-bearing sword sect was defeated by Xiao Qianfeng in a challenge. He held a grudge and brought a few of his fellow disciples to besiege Xiao Qianfeng. In the end, they were killed by Xiao Qianfeng instead. This angered the sect master of the heaven-burying sword sect. Now, the heaven-burying sword sect is pursuing Shao Qianfeng relentlessly. What's the background of the heaven-burying sword sect? Chu frowned and immediately asked. The heaven-burying sword sect is a new sect. It was founded less than 100 years ago, and its strength isn't very strong among the many sections. The sect master is called the Venerable Burying Sky, and he is at the peak of the origin realm. Rumor has it that he once killed a sword sovereign. According to the news, this Venerable Burying Sky has a great background and has a great backer, this person said in one breath. Venerable Burying Sky. Chu sneered. This title was very arrogant, and it was definitely a great tool to attract hatred. However, this guy should have some background and a great backer, which was why he could live until now. But, so what? One had to know that Shao Qianfeng was the first friend that Chu recognized, a true friend. If Shao Qianfeng was in trouble, Chu would never stand by and do nothing. He firmly believed that if Shao Qianfeng knew that he was in trouble, he would never stand by and do nothing. Now that he knew that Shao Qianfeng was in big trouble, he wouldn't pretend that he didn't know anything. It was inevitable that he would go against the heaven-burying sword sect, and this so-called Venerable Burying Sky might become a strong enemy. Venerable Burying Sky was able to kill a sword sovereign, which means that his strength has reached the level of a sword sovereign. Chu thought. Although he had the protection of the Azura sword of Gojoseon and the terrifying meteor sword energy, Chu still felt a great pressure. Do you know where Shao Qianfeng is now? Chu asked again. I don't know. The person quickly replied, but Shao Qianfeng has a friend called Xiaoyu. He might know. Xiaoyu? Where is he? Chu asked again. Chu didn't see this name on the Heavenly Sword Master roll. Let me see if he's here, the person said quickly. This person hastily said as he swept his eyes over the crowd. There were many people here and it wasn't easy to find a specific person. Chu could only wait. After a while, the person retracted his gaze and looked at Chu. He shook his head and said, Xiaoyu isn't here. Not here. Chu felt that things were getting tricky. The only person who might know Shao Qianfeng's whereabouts wasn't here. Other than his name, Chu didn't know anything else. There was no way to find him. For the first time, Chu felt helpless. This Xiaoyu seems to live in Tongtian Town. If you want to find him, maybe you can go to Tongtian Town to take a look, the person added. He also briefly described Xiaoyu's characteristics, which made Chu eyes light up. At least he saw a glimmer of hope. At this time, Chu no longer had any thoughts of entering the Heavenly Sword Tower. The Heavenly Sword Tower was here and wouldn't leave. He could enter it at any time. But Shao Qianfeng was probably being hunted now. The sooner he knew where he was, the sooner he could find him. As for becoming enemies with the buried Heaven Sword sect, Chu didn't care. There were some troubles that he didn't want to provoke, because there was no need. But there were some troubles that he had to provoke. Turning around, Chu was about to leave Tongtian Mountain when suddenly, loud laughter rang out. The laughter was filled with a domineering aura that looked down on everything. It came from afar. Ha 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 ha. Heavenly Sword Tower, I Zong Qintian am here. After the loud laughter, there was a thunderous voice. The first word seemed to come from afar, but the last word seemed to explode in everyone's ears. It made those swordsmen with weaker cultivations dizzy. Everyone raised their heads and looked over. They saw a figure flying over from afar like a bolt of lightning in the deep night sky. White arcs of lightning coiled around his body, crackling as they emitted waves of white luster and an extremely terrifying aura of destruction. This figure descended like a bolt of white lightning. With a boom, it landed on the top of Mount Tongtian, blasting the ground into pieces. Cracks as thick as thighs snaked across the ground like lightning bolts, rushing in all directions. The ground within a radius of 100 meters collapsed. This was a processed ground, so it was very hard. Even a high-grade sword would find it difficult to leave a mark on it. Chu Mu also stopped and looked at the person descending in an extremely domineering manner. He didn't look very strong, but he gave people the feeling that his shoulders could support the sky. He stood on Tongtian Mountain with his hands behind his back, as if he was one with Tongtian Mountain. He gave people a domineering feeling that no matter how strong the power was, it couldn't shake him. His eyes flickered with a strong light, which seemed to contain a sea of lightning that could destroy everything. Zong Qingtian. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 488. Zong Qingtian. This person's entrance was domineering, and the aura he exuded was terrifying. His sword qi cultivation was profound. At least, among all the qi high realm swordsmen that Chu Mu had met, no one could compare to Zong Qingtian in terms of cultivation. Chu Mu's intuition told him that this Zong Qingtian was very powerful, and he was no match for him now. Chu Mu was not depressed at all. Instead, he was looking forward to it. On the Heavenly Sword hero ranking, he was probably no match for the top 3 swordsmen. And now, Zong Qingtian had appeared. This person's name was definitely not on the Heavenly Sword hero ranking. Maybe this Zong Qingtian was not a swordsman from the Central Sword region, but came from somewhere else. Then, was he from the Southern Sword region? Or the Western Sword region? Or the Northern Sword region? Or the powerful and chaotic Overseas Sword region? Without giving Chu Mu much time to think, he stepped forward and used the Flying Swan illusory steps to leave quickly. He was about to rush out of the Tongtian Peak. Stay here. Zong Qingtian shouted coldly. He grabbed out with one hand and 5 extremely pure and condensed sword auras shot out from his 5 fingers. They quickly spun and formed a rapidly spinning sword aura cage, locking onto Chu Mu and falling down from above. Chu Mu could not help but feel a chill down his spine. This sword chi cage was very powerful. It contained a strong sword will and terrifying thunder will. Once trapped, it would be very difficult to get out. His body changed dozens of times in an instant, but the sword chi cage locked onto him, giving Chu Mu a feeling that he could not escape. Moon slashing. With a shout in his heart, he unsheathed the demon-slaying sword. He did not hold back at all. A 10-meter dark golden crescent moon broke through the air and slashed towards the sword chi cage. With a boom, the sword chi cage shattered, and the dark golden crescent moon slashed towards Zong Qingtian unstoppably. The surrounding light seemed to be sucked in, and it became dark. Zong Qingtian's eyes were filled with the dark golden crescent moon, and the world seemed to disappear. Good timing. Break for me. Zong Qingtian's long hair danced in the wind, and white lightning danced around him as he slashed out with his sword. A crackling sound rang out, and the darkness seemed to shatter like glass. A huge white lightning bolt broke through the air like a flood dragon and left the sword. Its momentum was vast and mighty, and a terrifying aura of destruction spread out. The sky above Mount Tongtian seemed to be torn apart by this sword. The terrifying white lightning collided with the dark golden crescent moon. In just an instant, the dark golden crescent moon was shattered by the white lightning. The white lightning, which had consumed half of its power, blasted towards the edge of the Tongtian mountain peak at an incomparably fast speed. With a boom, crushed rocks flew everywhere, and a 10-meter wide pit appeared. It was truly frightening. Let's fight another day. However, Chu Mu had already used the heaven-traversing flight secret technique to rush out of the Tongtian Peak. Then, he used the heaven-soaring secret technique to leave in a flash, leaving behind only a few words as he spiraled in the mighty mountain wind. The next time I see you, I'll definitely cut off your head. Zong Qingtian glanced at the direction that Chu Mu had left in. He didn't chase after him, but instead shouted. His voice was like rolling thunder, spreading out into Chu Mu's ears. His goal was to enter the Heavenly Sword Tower. As for attacking Chu Mu, it was only because he had just arrived, and Chu Mu was about to leave. This made him, who had always been domineering, feel dissatisfied. Zhong Qingtian's goal was to get first place, and step on the Heavenly Sword Realm's genius sword artists from the Central Main Sword Realm. Then, he would challenge those who were worthy of his challenge and kill them one by one, and break through to the Qi High Realm in a domineering manner. Speaking of which, this was not only Zhong Qingtian's goal, but also the goal of many sword masters. But in the end, only a few could achieve it. Most of the sword masters were destined to succumb to others. After Zhong Qingtian finished speaking, he shouted coldly and turned into a white lightning bolt, rushing into the Heavenly Sword Tower and disappearing. He had started to enter the tower. As soon as he disappeared, the terrifying pressure also disappeared. This is too scary. Who is this Zhong Qingtian? Yeah, who is this Zhong Qingtian? I feel that his aura is too scary. Even Gu Jianghe is not as strong as him. Could he be a sword master at the same level as Yan Zhiyu and Zhu Wudao? It must be. That sword strike of his just now contained 25% sword intent. This is going to be interesting. A sword master at the same level as Yan Zhiyu and Zhu Wudao. I have a feeling that a fierce battle is about to begin. There were also people who wanted to see the world in chaos. Don't just focus on that Zhong Qingtian. That person in the white robe is not simple either. His sword will reach 21%. That is the strength of someone who can be ranked in the top 10 of the Heavenly Sword Realm. I am sure that person is not on the Heavenly Sword Realm. Senior Sword of Gojoseon, are you saying that Zhong Qingtian also has a trump card similar to the Meteor Sword energy? Chu Mu asked as he flew quickly towards Heavenly Sword Town. I am not sure. I can only say that this person is not simple. In terms of strength, he is stronger than you. Even if you use the Meteor Sword energy, you may not be able to do anything to him. His background is not simple. Otherwise, he would not have such a life-saving trump card, the Shura Sword of Gojoseon said. Senior Sword of Gojoseon, what do you think the result will be if I fight Zhong Qingtian with my current strength? Chu Mu asked. If you use the Meteor Sword energy, he will not be able to do anything to you. If you use your own strength, you may not be able to withstand 3 of his swords, the Shura Sword of Gojoseon said without hesitation. 3 swords. Chu Mu was shocked, but he did not feel depressed. Instead, he felt his fighting spirit rise. His sword will, which was already restless, broke through the shackles and reached 22%. Sword will was something that stopped countless Qi high swordsmen. Only those swordsmen who were above the other geniuses could comprehend it. However, to what extent one could comprehend it to was another huge hurdle. Normally, 20% was a huge barrier. Many Qi High Realm sword warriors who were able to comprehend sword intent stopped at 20%. Only a few of them were able to break through. Even if they did break through, it would be extremely difficult to increase their sword intent. Every point was a huge barrier, unless they broke through to the 9th transformation realm. Now that his sword will had reached 22%, Chu Mu's attacking power had increased significantly. That Zhong Qingtian's background must be extraordinary. He received excellent training from a young age. In this aspect, he is 1,000 times better than you. Therefore, it is normal that you are not as good as him. But in terms of comprehension, you are above him. The Shura Sword of Gojoseon saw that Chu Mu was not depressed at all. Instead, his fighting spirit rose, and his sword will broke through the bottleneck. He is stronger than me now. This is a fact, but it can be changed. I believe that I can be stronger than him. Chu Mu said, not only in the sword master level, but in other levels, I will also be stronger than him. Belief, unparalleled belief. Only with an unshakable belief in oneself could one be qualified to reach the peak. Gu Jianghe, Yan Zhiyu, Zhu Wudao, Zhong Qingtian. These 4 names flashed through Chu Mu's mind. Subconsciously, he placed Zhong Qingtian last. He thought that Zhong Qingtian's strength was above Zhu Wudao. Although he had never seen Zhu Wudao and did not know his true strength, he had this feeling. Mountain Sword Dao. Underworld Sword Dao. Sky Sword Dao. They are all Mahayana Sword Dao. I wonder what Sword Dao Zhong Qingtian inherited? Chu Mu did not think that someone like Zhong Qingtian did not inherit the Sword Dao. With a whoosh, Chu Mu's figure cut through the night and arrived at the foot of Tongtian Mountain. He flew quickly towards Tongtian Town, which was still brightly lit. Tongtian Town was a place where good people mingled with bad people. There were people active 24 hours a day. Where should I find Xia Yu? Chu Mu thought to himself. Tongtian Town was not big, but the population was mixed. It was difficult to find someone with only a name and some characteristic. Stop, don't run. You offended. Buried heaven, and you still want to run in your dreams. A few shouts drifted over with the night wind, intermittently. Chu Mu tilted his head to listen. Immediately, Shao Qianfeng speak. Chu Mu's eyes shone with an intense light. A trace of killing intent was faintly discernible. He used soaring into the sky and flew towards the direction of the shout. In just a breath, Chu Mu saw a person surrounded. There were 4 people surrounding him. 4 Peak Chi high swordsmen. In an instant, Chu Mu made a judgment based on the chi they were emitting. He appeared above the 5 people and looked down. Who is it? Chu Mu's appearance immediately attracted the attention of the 5 people. They all looked up and shouted coldly. You are from the Buried Heaven Sword Sect? Chu Mu asked back. That's right, we are from the Buried Heaven Sword Sect. If you know what's good for you, get the hell out of here. One of the 4 shouted. You are Xia Yu? Chu Mu looked at the person who was surrounded. Although he was in a sorry state and was injured, the luxurious robe he was wearing could not hide his anger. According to some of the characteristics mentioned by others and the situation in front of him, Chu Mu was 80% sure that this guy was Xia Yu. I told you to get the hell out of here. Don't you understand human language? The person from the Buried Heaven Sword Sect said angrily. He threw out a beam of sword chi towards Chu Mu. Chu Mu pulled out his sword. It was as if he had 4 arms. 4 monster-slaying swords were thrown out at the same time, shattering the sword chi. 4 beams of sword chi fell down and split the 4 swordsmen of the Buried Heaven Sword Sect into pieces. They were only Peak Chi high swordsmen. Their strength was at most equivalent to a normal sword master. They were not Chu Mu's opponent at all. Who are you? The injured person looked at Chu Mu cautiously and asked in a low voice. Answer me, are you Xia Yu? Chu Mu asked back. His tone was overbearing and his eyes were sharp. His guess and Xia Yu's answer were 2 different things. I am Xia Yu. I am not your opponent. You can kill me or cut me up as you please. Xia Yu said and sat on the ground like a rascal. Since he was not his opponent, there was no point in resisting. He might as well be a coward. Most importantly, his intuition told him that the person in front of him had no intention of killing him. Do you know where Shao Qianfeng is? Chu Mu asked, his eyes staring at Xia Yu. Who is Shao Qianfeng? Oh, you are talking about the person who is ranked 8th on the Heavenly Sword ranking. I don't know where he is. Xia Yu's expression was very convincing. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 489. Oh, I have to go back to my hometown tomorrow and attend the wedding the day after tomorrow. You're the junior brother Chu Mu that boss Xiao mentioned? After Chu Mu reported his identity, Xia Yu actually revealed a look of understanding, which made Chu Mu a little stunned. It seemed that senior brother Shao Qianfeng had a good relationship with Xia Yu, otherwise, he wouldn't have told him this. Since Chu Mu's identity was confirmed, Xia Yu let down his guard against Chu Mu and brought Chu Mu to Xiao Qianfeng's hiding place. Along the way, he even asked Chu Mu several times, appearing to be very curious. Chu Mu didn't know what senior brother Xiao had told Xia Yu, but he still answered him without the slightest bit of impatience. He was just a little excited in his heart. Senior brother Xiao was chased by those bastards from the heaven-burying sword sect and is now slightly injured. I came out to scout for information, but I didn't expect to meet the people from the heaven-burying sword sect. If I didn't meet Brother Chu, I would definitely be brought back to the heaven-burying sword sect, Xia Yu said as he led the way. Senior brother Xiao is injured? Is it serious? Chu Mu's eyes flashed as he hurriedly asked. It's not very serious, but he still needs to recuperate for a period of time. Xia Yu was shocked by Chu Mu's sudden burst of killing intent and hurriedly said. Hearing that Xiao Qianfeng's injuries weren't very serious, Chu Mu was relieved, but his killing intent towards the heaven-burying sword sect only increased. Tong Tian town was indeed a very mixed town. Chu Mu didn't stop when he passed by, so he didn't feel it deeply. However, now that he followed Xia Yu into Tong Tian town, he could feel the chaotic aura everywhere. Presumably, Xiao Qianfeng's hiding place was extremely secretive. Xia Yu brought Chu Mu around the majority of Tong Tian town. Moreover, they took small paths that were extremely remote. Most of the paths were pitch black, and none of the paths were repeated. Chu Mu was also very patient. Finally, Xia Yu stopped in front of a very secluded house. Then, he raised his hand and knocked on the door 9 times rhythmically, as if it was some kind of secret signal. Come in. About 10 breaths later, a weak voice came from inside. Xia Yu pushed open the wooden door and explained to Chu Mu, "This is the secret signal that Boss Xiao and I have agreed on. If I come, I will knock 9 times. If the door is pushed open directly, it means that it is not me, and Boss Xiao has to hide in the cellar first. There are 2 cellars here. One is a normal cellar, and the other is a very secret cellar. Other than the person who built it, no one else knows about it." Chu Mu nodded. This Xia Yu looked like a person who was cold on the outside but passionate on the inside. Chu Mu did not expect him to be so cautious and watertight. "Boss Xiao, guess who I brought?" After Xia Yu brought Chu Mu into the small courtyard, he said excitedly. However, his voice was not loud and was controlled within a certain range. Chu Mu also saw a person walk out of the small house. That familiar figure made Chu Mu even more excited. "Senior brother Xiao," Chu Mu shouted. "You are junior brother Chu." When Xiao Qianfeng heard Chu Mu's words, his face was first filled with astonishment. Then, his whole body shook, and an indescribable ecstasy appeared on his face. He rushed over with large strides. "Junior brother Chu, it really is you." Xiao Qianfeng pressed his hands on Chu Mu's shoulders. His face was filled with excitement, and his eyes were trembling. His heart was in a perilous situation. "Senior brother Xiao, it's me." Chu Mu calmed down first, but the excitement in his heart was still there. The 2 of them were both people who weren't good with words. Chu Mu was a bit better, but Xiao Qianfeng was truly a man of few words. Although he was extremely excited, he mostly hid it in his heart and only showed a small portion of it. Xia Yu stood at the side and did not say anything. He knew that now was not the time for him to speak. After a while, Xiao Qianfeng also calmed down. "Junior brother Chu inside," Xiao Qianfeng said. The 3 of them walked into the house and closed the door. Xia Yu took out a luminous pearl and placed it on the table. Immediately, the darkness in the small house was dispelled, and the house lit up. "Senior brother Xiao, how are your injuries?" Chu Mu asked as soon as he sat down. "I should be fine after recuperating for half a month," Xiao Qianfeng said, a trace of sharpness flashing in his eyes. "I have some healing pills here. They are very effective. After taking them, they will dissolve. Senior brother Zhao's injuries should be healed in less than 3 days, Chu Mu said as he took out a bottle of pills from his spatial wristband. This pill belonged to Qing Yuanchuan. It was a pill used by Origin Realm swordsmen, and it was the more precious kind. It would definitely be effective for a Qi High swordsman to use. Xiao Qianfeng nodded. He did not decline, nor did he say any polite words, and took the bottle of pills. Junior brother, when did you come to the central main sword region? Xiao Qianfeng did not immediately take the pills, but asked instead. A few months ago. Chu Mu gave a rough explanation. Did junior brother go to the Heavenly Sword Tower? Xiao Qianfeng asked again. I went to the Heavenly Sword Tower and saw senior brother Zhao's name on the Heavenly Sword ranking. That's why I went to look for senior brother Xiao, Chu Mu said. When I went out, I was found by the buried Heaven Sword sect. If it wasn't for brother Chu's timely appearance, I would have been in danger, Xia Yu quickly said. I also heard people talking about you at the top of the Tongtian mountain, so I rushed down to find you, Chu Mu said with a smile. This Xia Yu's sword chi was at the peak of the Qi High realm. Looking at his age, he should be around the same age as Chu Mu. At most, he was younger by a few months. It would be rare for someone to have this kind of cultivation at this age in the eastern main sword region, but it was normal in the central main sword region. However, this Xia Yu also had the strength of a sword master, but it was probably just a normal sword master. Otherwise, he would not have been chased by the 4 swordsmen from the buried Heaven Sword sect. The central main sword region was blessed by the heavens. There were many swordsmen who had the strength of a sword master. Even if they could not become a sword master before the age of 30, many swordsmen would have the strength of a normal sword master after the age of 30. Some of them could even have the strength of a strong sword master. As for Xiao Qianfeng's cultivation, he was also at the peak of the Qi High realm. After all, he had received the inheritance of the sword Dao. Even if it was only the Hinayana sword Dao, he was still stronger than swordsmen who did not receive the inheritance of the sword Dao. Also, he had entered the central main sword region a few years ago, so the skill he practiced absorbed spirit qi. Although they were both at the peak of the Qi High realm, Xiao Qianfeng's strength was much stronger than Xia Yu's. There was no comparison between the two. Xiao Qianfeng could probably kill Xia Yu in one strike. I'll go get some food and drink. Let's have a good chat. Xia Yu stood up and left in big strides. Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng chatted to their heart's content. They both asked about each other's situation in the past few years. Chu Mu briefly explained everything that had happened in the Eastern Sword region. He kept some of the more in-depth information to himself. It was not that he did not trust Xiao Qianfeng, but that there were some things that could be said. There were some things that did not need to be said so clearly and thoroughly. It was enough for him to know. Junior brother's experience is really exciting. The Great Kuan Sword Palace, the Heaven Wasteland Palace, the battle for fortune. If only I could participate. Xiao Qianfeng showed a trace of yearning. Senior brother Xiao is now ranked 8th on the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking. In the Eastern Sword region, you would be a Sword Hero King. Your experience must be very exciting. I can't wait. Chu Mu smiled and said, I wonder where senior brother Xiao went after falling off the cliff. I was saved by someone. Xiao Qianfeng replied. His eyes flashed with traces of memories. Chu Mu actually saw a trace of tenderness in Xiao Qianfeng's eyes. Tenderness? Chu Mu thought that he had seen wrongly. Xiao Qianfeng's impression in Chu Mu's heart was not tenderness at all. Could it be an illusion? Chu Mu thought to himself. But as Xiao Qianfeng continued speaking, he knew that it was not an illusion. Xiao Qianfeng had someone in his heart that he cared about. Immediately, he could not help but feel happy for senior brother Xiao. This was good. Although he was pursuing the pinnacle of the way of the sword, it did not mean that he had cut off all emotions and desires. The way of the sword was not the way of the heartless. Of course, the majority of swordsmen chose to cast aside all emotions and focus on the way of the sword. They walked a lonely path. But since ancient times there were also some swordsmen who had partners. Not only did they not neglect the way of the sword, but they also received an inexplicable boost and rushed to a higher level. Among the various Mahayana sword daos that the Asura sword of Gojoseon had told Chumu, one of them was called the emotional sword Dao. No matter what, it was a good thing that Xiao Qianfeng had someone in his heart that he cared about. Senior brother Xiao, when are you going to bring me to visit senior sister's wife? Chumu joked. Cough cough. Xiao Qianfeng, who was speaking, seemed to have choked. His face was red, and Chumu laughed. There will be a chance in the future. Seeing that Xiao Qianfeng was so thin-skinned, Chumu did not continue to tease him. Instead, he asked about Xiao Qianfeng's experience. Exchanging experiences was also a kind of cultivation method. One could gain something from other people's experiences. Xiao Qianfeng naturally would not say everything. Some things only needed to be known by oneself. From Xiao Qianfeng's experience, Chumu learned that Xiao Qianfeng had inherited the endless sword Dao. Later on, he had a fortuitous encounter and inherited the lifeless sword Dao. The lifeless sword Dao and the endless sword Dao were both Mahayana sword Daos. However, Mahayana sword Daos were also divided into high and low levels. The lifeless sword Dao was much stronger than the endless sword Dao. In history, there had been swordsmen who had inherited two sword Daos. However, they were two sword Daos with similar power. Moreover, they each had their own characteristics and could even complement each other. The endless sword Dao was inferior to the lifeless sword Dao. One only needed to choose one of the two. After weighing the pros and cons, Xiao Qianfeng gave up on the endless sword Dao and chose the lifeless sword Dao. This was before he challenged for the sword hero title. Therefore, his sword hero title was called Lifeless Sword Hero and not Endless Sword Hero. Among the Mahayana sword Dao that the Asura sword of Gojoseon had taught Chumu, the lifeless sword Dao was one of the top Mahayana sword Daos. It was also Xiao Qianfeng's fortune to be able to obtain such a sword Dao inheritance. Not long after, Xia Yu returned with steaming dishes and wine. He placed them on the table and poured wine. The three of them drank and chatted. With the help of wine, the topic became more and more open, and they became more familiar with each other. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 490. Chumu, Xiao Qianfeng, and Xia Yu chatted as they drank. They chatted until dawn. Of course, they weren't just chatting. Towards the end, it was basically an exchange between Xiao Qianfeng and Chumu. Xia Yu couldn't get a word in edgewise. But Xia Yu had no intention of interrupting. Instead, he was very happy. In terms of ability, he was far inferior to Chumu and Xiao Qianfeng. In terms of understanding of sword Dao, he couldn't compare at all. Now that there were two swordsmen who were miles ahead of him in terms of sword Dao analyzing and discussing sword Dao, all he had to do was empty his ears and listen attentively. It would be best if he could remember everything. It didn't matter if he could understand it now or not. After that, Xiao Qianfeng strongly suggested that Chumu challenge the Heavenly Sword Tower. Chumu thought that Xiao Qianfeng would need at least 3 days to recover. He could stay here for 3 days, but it wasn't a big deal. After hearing Xiao Qianfeng's suggestion, he was tempted and left in the dark. It was night again. Chumu came to the Heavenly Sword Peak again. This time, his arrival attracted the attention of some people, and then attracted the attention of many swordsmen. After all, last night Chumu had come here. More importantly, the move he made had a sword intent of 21%. Such strength was definitely a powerful existence that could be ranked in the top 10 of the Heavenly Sword hero ranking. More importantly, he had exchanged blows with Zhong Qingtian. Zhong Qingtian was now famous. Chumu wasn't in a hurry to enter the Heavenly Sword Tower. Instead, he walked towards the Heavenly Sword hero list to see if there were any changes. Zhong Qingtian had come here last night to challenge the Heavenly Sword Tower. Chu Mu subconsciously thought that Zhong Qingtian's ability wasn't below Zhu Wudao's. He might even be stronger. Walking towards the Heavenly Sword Hero list, Chu Mu's gaze landed on the black sword steel. He couldn't help but tremble. The number 1 name was no longer Zhu Wudao. Zhong Qingtian, Annihilation Sword Hero, 31 levels in 1 day. Zhong Qingtian. Chu Mu repeated in a voice only he could hear. As expected, he immediately suppressed Zhu Wudao and reached the 31st level of the Heavenspan Sword Tower. The Heavenly Sword Pagoda had 99 levels, but they all corresponded to each other. The 33rd level corresponded to a level of Sword Dao. In other words, the first floor to the 33rd floor corresponded to the Sword of Gojoseon, the 34th floor to the 66th floor corresponded to the Sword Venerable, and the 67th floor to the 99th floor corresponded to the Sword of Gojoseon. Since ancient times, very few swordsmen had been able to make it to the 33rd floor. At the very least, such a person had not appeared in the past 1,000 years. Even if it was the 32nd floor, only one sword hero had done so in the past 1,000 years. Because of this, his name had been passed down through the ages. Of course, that sword hero was now one of the top 3 Sword of Gojoseon list, one of the powerful Sword of Gojoseon. As for the 31st floor, although there were more than 1 or 2, there had not been more than 10 in the past 1,000 years. Zhong Qingtian could be said to be the 11th swordsman to reach the 31st floor in the past 1,000 years. He was the first swordsman to reach the 31st floor in 100 years. As for swordsmen above the Qi High Realm who wanted to challenge the Heavenspan Sword Tower, they would only go straight to the 34th floor. Being the first sword hero to reach the 31st floor in 100 years was a great honor. The news has already spread. Once Zhu Wudao and Yan Jiao know, they will definitely rush over. That's right. They will definitely not allow anyone to step on their heads. Exciting. An exciting battle is about to happen. The so-called battle referred to the battle to obtain a higher ranking in the Heavenspan Sword Tower. Of course, if it was a face-to-face battle, they would definitely be more than happy to see it. Speaking of which, besides Zhong Qingtian, there are 3 other incredible people who came today. They entered the top 10 on their first attempt at the Heavenspan Sword Tower. Yeah, I wonder where these people came from. I know. This Zhong Qingtian came from overseas. The other 3 came from the Western Sword Region, the Southern Sword Region, and the Northern Sword Region. Someone who knew more about them said proudly, moreover, they are all sword hero kings from their respective sword regions. You guys said that the sword hero kings from the Southern, Northern, Western, and overseas sword regions are challenging the Heavenspan Sword Tower. Then, where is the sword hero king from the Eastern Sword Region? Someone suddenly said. The sword hero king from the Eastern Sword Region should be here. But I don't know when. I remember that in the past, the sword hero kings from the Southern, Northern, and Southern Sword Regions couldn't even enter the top 20 when they challenged the Heavenspan Sword Tower for the first time. Their best result was also outside the top 10. But this time they actually entered the top 10. Could it be that a golden age is coming? The people who were discussing spiritedly didn't know that the sword hero king from the Eastern Sword Region they were talking about was here. Chu Mu ignored them and looked down. The second place was still Zhu Wudao, the third place was Yan Jiao, and the fourth place was still Gu Jianghe. But the 5th, 6th, and 7th places had changed. Xiao Qianfeng's ranking suddenly fell to the 12th place. Demonic Lion Dominator, 100 Beasts Sword Hero, 28 levels in 1 day. Han Bingyu, Heartless Sword Hero, 28 levels in 1 day. West Wind Ardent, Formless Sword Hero, 28 levels in 1 day. As for the original 4th place, it was now pushed to the 8th place. Chu Mu couldn't help but be surprised. This Zhong Qingtian came from the Overseas Sword Region. The Overseas Sword Region had always been chaotic. In terms of strength, it was not inferior to the Central Sword Region. Whether it was on the ancient Sword Continent or on Earth, The overseas sword region had the same characteristic, mysterious and unfathomable. The overseas sword region was a mysterious place that required countless time to explore. The resources there were incomparably rich and unimaginable. Since ancient times, no one had ever explored the entire overseas sword region. The deeper areas were not only mysterious but also extremely dangerous. It was not a place that could be reached by human strength. Compared to the central main sword domain, an even more unique environment had created an even stronger outer sea sword domain. If not for the fact that there were many islands in the overseas sword region and that most of the islands were in a hostile state, once they joined forces, they would be able to defeat the central sword region's forces. That was why it was normal for Zhong Qingtian to have such strength, being born in such a unique environment and having frequent battles in the overseas sword region. As for the other three, the South, West, and North sword regions were originally stronger than the East sword region, but they weren't that much stronger. The sudden appearance of 3 sword hero kings that could enter the top 10 or even top 8 of the heavenly sword hero ranking truly shocked Chu Mu. This kind of strength was much stronger than Lai Kongyang's by quite a bit. If Chu Mu had not appeared in the East sword region, they would have been completely trampled under the feet of the South, West, and North sword regions. South sword region, West sword region, North sword region, overseas sword region. Since you're all here, it's my turn now. Chu Mu thought to himself. An aura surged from his body. It was not sword pressure or sword will, but just pure aura. It was similar to a battle intent that shot up into the sky. The surrounding people were alarmed and looked at Chu Mu one by one. In the next moment, Chu Mu took a step forward. His body flashed and rushed into the heavenly sword tower. It was as though he had been swallowed and disappeared. Chu Mu felt as though he had suddenly entered another world. He could not feel the slightest bit of spiritual qi. He could not even see a trace of light. Even his perfect vision sword had lost its effect. Immediately after, Chu Mu felt an aura that came from nowhere. It was very erratic and unpredictable. It swept past his body, as though even his soul had been swept. In an instant it disappeared again, as though it was an illusion. Although he was surprised, Chu Mu didn't resist. He had already heard that this was an inevitable process. No one knew when this heavenly sword tower appeared. It was incomparably mysterious. Even sword saints' attacks couldn't damage it in the slightest. It was said that the heavenly sword tower had a spirit, but it had never appeared. Anyone who entered the heavenly sword tower to challenge would be examined by the spirit of the sword tower. The purpose was to arrange a suitable challenge. From Xiao Qianfeng and Xia Yu, Chu Mu already knew the challenge method of the heavenly sword tower. After the spirit of the sword tower completed the examination, the challenger would be sent to the first level of the heavenly sword tower to start the challenge. The challenge method was for the spirit of the sword tower to arrange an opponent. The strength of the opponent would be adjusted according to the challenger's strength. To put it simply, the opponent arranged for the first level of the heavenly sword tower was a strong virtual opponent condensed by the power of the heavenly sword tower according to the spirit of the sword tower's comprehensive examination of the challenger. This virtual opponent's sword chi cultivation was exactly the same as the challenger's, and the level of the sword he used was exactly the same as the challenger's. Of course, the style of the sword was random. In addition, the number of sword intents the challenger had comprehended, the level of sword intent, and so on were also provided. Lastly, did the challenger inherit the sword Tao? Did he inherit the Mahayana sword Tao or the Hinayana sword Tao? The level of mastery of the sword Tao was also provided by the virtual opponent. However, it might not necessarily be the sword Tao that the challenger had. In short, the opponents arranged by the spirit of the sword tower were basically powerful opponents who were comparable to the challenger in all aspects. Moreover, each opponent had a certain level of battle talent and battle experience. Of course, in terms of the sword Tao and the application of various powers, they were also at the average level of a swordsman. Of course, for a powerful sword genius, such an opponent might be a little troublesome, but it was nothing to worry about. After all, the strength of these opponents was completely fixed, unlike real people who could fluctuate. The main thing was that after passing the first level and entering the second level, the number of such opponents would increase from 1 to 2. After passing the third level, the number of such strong virtual opponents would increase to 3. On the fourth level, there would be 4, and so on. When one reached the 33rd level, there would be 33 of such opponents. Moreover, when each virtual opponent attacked, it would be a battle of life and death. It didn't matter who won or lost. If one wasn't killed by them, one would have to kill them. Only in this way could one continue to pass the levels. Another important point was that once there was more than one of these strong virtual opponents, they would join forces. The more of them there were, the more powerful their combined strength would be. This was also the reason why many powerful sword heroes were killed and left the Heavenly Sword Tower before they could pass the first few levels. Chu Mu, who understood this, felt his blood boiling. His sword was humming. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 491. His surroundings suddenly lit up. Chu Mu found himself in a sealed space. This space was very strange. It didn't seem big, but it also seemed to be infinitely big. To Chu Mu's surprise, a figure seemed to walk out of nothingness. It didn't have the slightest bit of aura and appeared in front of Chu Mu. He was expressionless. His long hair was tied behind his head, and he wore a long white robe. Chu Mu felt that his appearance was familiar, as though he had seen him somewhere before. However, Chu Mu was sure that he had never seen this person before. There was an ear-piercing clang. A sword light descended like a bolt of lightning from the heavens. The sharp killing intent attacked Chu Mu's entire body. Chu Mu had been on high alert ever since he entered the Heavenly Sword Pagoda. When he saw the other party directly attack, his expression didn't change. He wasn't surprised at all. He unsheathed the demon-slaying sword and counterattacked. In an instant the two swords crossed. Chu Mu crossed with his opponent and stood still with his back to his back. After 3 breaths, Chu Mu's virtual opponent exploded. In the previous exchange of swords, Chu Mu's sword had pierced his throat. Under normal circumstances, no matter how powerful a swordsman was, once his throat was pierced, he would die. The virtual character created by the spirit of the Sword Pagoda also had this feature. The moment the virtual swordsman disappeared, a strand of Chu Mu's hair fell by his ear. In that instant it was extremely dangerous. If there had been a slight deviation, the one whose throat was pierced wouldn't have been the virtual swordsman, but Chu Mu. Of course, Chu Mu wouldn't really die. He would only be sent out of the Heavenly Sword Pagoda by the spirit of the Sword Pagoda. After a breath of time, Chu Mu felt his body change slightly, and he recovered to his peak state. He knew that he had entered the second level of the Heavenly Sword Tower. However, the second level didn't seem to be any different from the first level. Immediately after, 2 figures seemed to walk out of nothingness and appeared in front of Chu Mu. Both of them were wearing white robes and were similarly expressionless. Their appearances seemed to be the same, but upon closer inspection, they were different. After looking at them, Chu Mu realized that he had already forgotten what his opponent on the first level looked like. He had no impression of him at all. The 2 virtual swordsmen drew their swords and attacked at the same time, one stabbing and the other slashing. Their killing intent was incomparably sharp, and they attacked from the left and right sides of Chu Mu. They grasped the perfect timing, and it was as if the 2 of them were telepathically connected, working together perfectly. Under the cooperation of these 2 powerful opponents, Chu Mu couldn't kill them in one strike like before, because their combined power was significantly enhanced. When he drew his sword, the sword light was sharp, and the sword shadow was cold. The demon-slaying sword broke apart the two swords and slashed out like a line between the sea and the sky, cutting towards the throats of the two virtual swordsmen. Kill. However, the swordsmanship of these two virtual swordsmen was extraordinary. Every strike contained the same powerful sword intent and terrifying mutated intent realm as Chu Mu. After avoiding Chu Mu's killing sword, the two of them moved quickly, stabbing and slashing their swords at Chu Mu. Their swords were unusually sharp, and their killing intent was awe-inspiring. Chu Mu used the flying swan illusory steps to move around. The three figures moved unpredictably like butterflies among flowers. For a moment, both sides couldn't do anything to each other. Chu Mu didn't obtain any sword Dao inheritance, so his opponents didn't have any sword Dao inheritance either. However, Chu Mu's strength was extremely strong. Even swordsmen who had obtained sword Dao inheritance might not be his match. Naturally, his opponents were also very strong. Of course, the strength of these virtual swordsmen was fixed. Their combat talent was also fixed. They surpassed ordinary swordsmen, but they were definitely not as good as swordsmen like Chu Mu. Otherwise, if everything was on the same level, then no matter which swordsman, even if they could pass the first level, it would be difficult for them to pass the third level, let alone the third level. As for the 30th or 31st level, it was completely wishful thinking. Although they were not as good as Chu Mu, they were very close. At least in terms of sword chi cultivation, the purity of sword chi, the power of intent realm, and the strength of sword intent, they were not inferior to Chu Mu. If he wanted to defeat his opponents, he could only rely on his well-tempered swordsmanship and extraordinary combat talent. Chu Mu discovered that his opponent's swordsmanship was extremely high. Compared to him, his opponent's swordsmanship was only slightly weaker. Moreover, his opponent's footwork was also very advanced. It was almost no weaker than the flying swan illusory steps. He was excited to see his opponent and started to move around. He was not in a hurry to kill his opponent. No wonder Shao Qianfeng wanted him to challenge the Heavenly Sword Tower. An opponent like this could completely increase his overall strength. It should be known that the current Chu Mu, other than increasing his cultivation and sword intent, could only increase his strength through swordsmanship and footwork. Moreover, every bit of improvement was extremely difficult, unless he broke through the Qi High realm and reached the 9th transformation realm. After 15 minutes, Chu Mu had completely grasped the swordsmanship and footwork of these two virtual swordsmen. Although they were also using basic swordsmanship, they each had their own unique characteristic. Of course, basic swordsmanship was only the most basic thing. When a powerful swordsman cultivated his basic swordsmanship to a certain level, he would make some changes according to his own characteristics, making the basic swordsmanship more suitable for him to unleash his power. Different powerful swordsmen's basic swordsmanship had their own unique characteristic. Each of them had their own advantages and advantages. The unique characteristic of Chu Mu's swordsmanship was that it could accommodate everything. It could absorb all the advantages and remove all the disadvantages, allowing his own swordsmanship to improve bit by bit and the power of his swordsmanship to increase bit by bit. Seizing an opportunity, Chu Mu's sword slashed across the throat of one of the virtual swordsmen. Then, his figure leaped back like a swallow and his sword slashed across the neck of the other virtual swordsman, severing it. Since Chu Mu entered the Heavenly Sword Tower, many people had been paying attention to him. Although they did not know Chu Mu, they had already seen part of the strength that Chu Mu displayed last night. That strength was enough to place him in the top 10 of the Heavenly Sword ranking. Look, that person has already reached the 3rd level. What's so strange about reaching the 3rd level? With the sword intent that he displayed at 21%, I reckon that reaching the 28th level should not be a problem. That may be the case, but it's not necessarily true. Some people have powerful sword intent but ordinary battle talent. That's true. There are differences between geniuses. Some geniuses are suited for cultivation, but their perception and combat talent are average. Some geniuses have average cultivation talent, but their perception and combat talent are extraordinary. Some geniuses have average cultivation talent, but their perception and combat talent are extraordinary. Some geniuses have average cultivation talent and perception, but their combat talent is astonishing. That's right. There are too few geniuses who have both. And perfect geniuses who have extraordinary cultivation talent and astonishing comprehension and battle talent are even rarer. At least, I have never heard of such a person. Zhu Wudao and Yan Zhuyo barely qualify. I wonder if this Zhong Qingtian is such a perfect genius. After about 15 minutes, Chu Mu reached the 4th level. There was a special feature of the Heavenly Sword Tower. When someone challenged the tower, no one else could enter, unless the challenger left the Heavenly Sword Tower. Of course, because the Heavenly Sword Tower had 99 levels and was divided into 33 levels, there could be a Sword Master, a Sword Venerable, and the Sword of Gojoseon challenging the tower at the same time. However, compared to Sword Master level swordsmen, Sword Venerable level swordsmen and Sword of Gojoseon level swordsmen were even rarer. This was because it was 10 times or 100 times more difficult for them to improve their strength compared to Sword Master level swordsmen. Therefore, it was very rare for a Sword Venerable to challenge a Sword Pagoda, and it was even rarer for a Sword King to challenge a Sword Pagoda. Usually, it would attract a large number of swordsmen to watch, and it would become a popular topic for a long time. Isn't this person challenging the tower too slow? Yes. I saw that the top 10 swordsmen challenging the tower were much faster than this person in the first 10 levels. It seems that he is a genius with good comprehension, but his combat talent is average. Otherwise, with such a powerful sword intent, he would be able to challenge the tower very quickly. He might have already reached the 10th level or above. How could he still be lingering on the 5th level? That's right. Chu Mu had reached the 5th level, and 5 powerful virtual swordsmen were besieging him. These 5 virtual swordsmen had different sword styles. One was sharp, one was full of vitality, one was continuous, one was explosive and fierce, and one was steady and heavy. They corresponded to the 5 elements of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. The swords they used were also unique. The 5 of them worked together and stood in 5 positions, forming the 5 elements. Chu Mu was trapped in the center. His figure changed, and the flying swan illusory steps made him invincible. Chu Mu dealt with them while observing their swordsmanship, footwork, and so on, absorbing the essence. He was glad that although the 5 virtual swordsmen worked together and their power increased greatly, they didn't use the sword formation. Chu Mu estimated that if these 5 swordsmen used the 5 elements sword formation, Chu Mu wouldn't be a match for them. After all, no matter how good their cooperation was, it couldn't be compared to the sword formation. The sword formation was a kind of technique that followed the heaven and earth. It was mysterious and profound. Under the siege of the 5 powerful virtual swordsmen, Chu Mu dealt with them while counterattacking. When he felt that it was about time, he started to use his killer move. Chu Mu didn't use the incomplete moon-slashing sword technique because he knew that once he used the sword technique, his opponents would also use the same sword technique. The number of times he used the sword technique would be the same as the number of chances his opponents would have to use the sword technique. Moreover, it was hard to say when they would use the sword technique. These virtual swordsmen's combat talent wasn't bad, and they could accurately grasp the timing. Therefore, every swordsman who challenged the sword pagoda had to remember one thing. Unless it was absolutely necessary, they definitely wouldn't use any sword technique. Think about it. For example, if you reached the 10th level and there were 10 powerful virtual swordsmen, it would be impossible for you to kill all of them in a short period of time. If you used your sword technique, would you be able to survive the sword techniques of 10 powerful swordsmen who were close to your level? The power of that sword technique was on the same level as the sword technique that you possess. It was the kind of killing sword technique that would cause serious injuries or even death upon contact. If it evolved into a clash of sword techniques, it was basically certain that no sword Grandmaster level swordsman would be able to clear the 10th level. That wouldn't be displaying a swordsman's true strength. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 492. The 10th floor of the Heavenly Sword Tower lit up, indicating that a challenger had entered the 10th floor. Under normal circumstances, the 99 floors of the Heavenly Sword Tower were dark, but as long as someone entered, the floor would light up. Compared to the other floors, it was very conspicuous. Why is this person so slow? Hurry up and fail the challenge. I still have to challenge. Because Chu Mu's challenge speed was slow, some swordsmen were dissatisfied. It couldn't be helped. The Heavenly Sword Tower had such a rule. There could only be one challenger at a time. This was the rule set by the spirit of the Sword Tower. Even sword saints couldn't change it. After all, the Heavenly Sword Tower was the home of the spirit of the Sword Tower. The rules it set had to be followed. It didn't matter if you were a sword saint. It didn't give you face. It was said that until now, no one had seen the spirit of the Sword Tower, and no one had spoken to it. There were a few sword saints who personally came here to talk to the spirit of the Sword Tower, but the spirit of the Sword Tower ignored them. No matter what they said, it ignored them. In the end, it seemed that the spirit of the Sword Tower was impatient. The Heavenly Sword Tower erupted with a powerful energy and directly sent the sword saints flying. Since then, no one dared to look for trouble. Sword saints were the top power in the ancient sword continent. After all, the sword god was just a legend. No one knew if it really existed. Even sword saints couldn't help, so the other swordsmen could only wait obediently. At this moment, Chu Mu was hated by others, who told him to challenge so slowly. The time he took to pass each floor was more than twice as long as others. This guy must be bitterly holding on now. He's in a very sorry state. He should be killed soon, someone said sarcastically. Not only this person, but most of the other swordsmen also had the same thought. But the reality was the opposite. It was as if the spirit of the Sword Tower was against them. The 10th floor darkened in anticipation, and the next moment, the 11th floor lit up in disbelief. Following that, there was another long wait before the 11th floor darkened again. Dead, he's definitely dead. The 12th floor lit up. It was as if he wanted to oppose them to the end. Every time they thought that the challenger was about to be killed and sent out of the Heavenly Sword Tower, the next level would light up. As time passed, the 20th level of the Heavenly Sword Pagoda lit up. Those swordsmen who were secretly cursing Chu Mu to be killed almost vomited blood. Is this guy doing this on purpose? Motherf *Ker, when he comes out, I'll definitely teach him a lesson. A fierce-looking swordsman said angrily, looking incomparably ferocious. On the 20th floor of the Heavenly Sword Tower, Chu Mu was besieged by 20 powerful virtual swordsmen. The 20 powerful virtual swordsmen were extremely fast, displaying their body movements to the fullest. The sword light flashed, and the sword shadows crisscrossed. Every sword attack contained a horrifying mutated mentality and powerful sword intent, which had a shocking lethality. If one was hit by a sword attack, one would die for sure. Swish, 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 swish. Every sword light cut through the air, sharp to the extreme. The sword light was either straight or curved, each with its own unique characteristic. Some sword light even lashed out like a long whip, some sword light was like an endless torrent of water, and some sword light condensed into a single point, but had an astonishing sharpness. The 20 different sword lights seemed chaotic, but in fact they were seamlessly coordinated. Every blind spot was swept past. Even if two sword light collided with each other, they would not cancel each other out. Instead, they would be refracted, forming an inescapable net. Chu Mu was in the middle of these seemingly endless and terrifying sword light. He was like a small boat in the middle of a stormy sea that could be smashed to pieces by the huge waves at any time. The flying swan illusory steps had been executed to the extreme, and there was even a hint of transcendence. When Chu Mu broke through to the flying swan illusory steps, it was defined as having 3 levels. The overall characteristic was that it was light, fast, and elegant. The characteristic of the first level was that it seemed motionless but was actually moving. The characteristic of the second level was that it seemed to be advancing, retreating, advancing, and retreating. The characteristic of the third level was that it alternated between reality and illusion, changing unpredictably. Chu Mu's concept of clouds turning into the concept of illusion and reality had a certain connection with the third level of the flying swan illusory step. Chu Mu had already practiced the flying swan illusory steps to the third level and combined it with the concept of illusion and reality. He had reached perfection. And now, after going through the challenges of each level of the heavenly sword pagoda and entering the ethereal realm under high pressure, he constantly used the flying swan illusory steps to dodge or counterattack with his sword technique. This caused the flying swan illusory steps to continuously improve, and there was already a hint of breaking away from the shackles of the flying swan illusory step. However, at this moment, Chu Mu had entered the ethereal realm and did not notice at all. Now that he was under high pressure, there was only one thought in his mind, and that was to dodge and counterattack. The 20 powerful virtual swordsmen, under their tacit cooperation, displayed a terrifying power. Hypothetically speaking, if these 20 powerful virtual swordsmen did not cooperate well, Chu Mu was confident that he could easily defeat them one by one without consuming too much energy. However, after the 20 powerful virtual swordsmen cooperated well, Chu Mu was unable to defeat them one by one. When he slashed at one of them with a sure kill momentum, he was indeed 100% sure that he could kill the target, but at the same time, he would be attacked by at least 3 swords or more. Although this kind of attack was not as powerful as sword techniques, it was enough to be fatal. Think about it, every sword was condensed with terrifying sword aura, as well as tyrannical concept of variation and sword intent. Once stabbed, even if he did not die, he would be seriously injured. It was conceivable that under the attacks of such terrifying opponents, once he was injured and his movements were affected, he would most likely not be able to last long and would be killed. The challenge would be a failure. Therefore, Chu Mu had to constantly dodge and find the best opportunity to counterattack. As the number of opponents increased, it became harder and harder to seize the opportunity. In addition, Chu Mu intended to hone his footwork and swordsmanship, so the time dragged on even longer. Up, down, left, right, front, and back, Chu Mu's figure was like a butterfly shuttling through the endless sword light. He was also like a wisp of smoke, changing constantly and could dissipate at any time, causing the sword light to miss. The 20 powerful virtual swordsmen did not have human emotions and were in a state of absolute calmness at all times. Therefore, even if their swords did not hit Chu Mu, they would not have any impatience. They just kept attacking with their swords, becoming fiercer and fiercer. After all, the spirit of the sword pagoda was not omnipotent. It could create powerful virtual swordsmen, but it was limited to the heavenly sword pagoda. Moreover, it could not create human emotions. No matter which world it was, human emotions had always been the most complicated and unpredictable thing. Finally, Chu Mu found the best opportunity. With a slash of his sword, he cut off the head of a powerful virtual swordsman. His figure flashed, and he dodged 4 sword light. Of the 20 powerful virtual swordsmen, only 19 were left. Their tacit cooperation was disrupted. Although they immediately adjusted in less than 3 breaths, another one died under Chu Mu's sword. This was one of the weaknesses of the virtual swordsman. Once one died, they had to adjust their cooperation. After all, their cooperation was based on the whole. However, it took some time for them to adjust. Even if it was just one breath, it was enough for Chu Mu, who had amazing combat talent, to react. In 3 breaths, the number of virtual swordsmen that died under Chu Mu's sword reached 3. The weakness of these virtual swordsmen began to show. Every time one died, they had to adjust again. Each adjustment took some time, which gave Chu Mu the best opportunity to defeat them one by one. Not long after, the 21st level of the Heavenly Sword Pagoda lit up. Those swordsmen who hoped that Chu Mu would be killed quickly were disappointed once again. Of course, there were also those who were full of interest and even anticipation. 22nd level, 23rd level, 24th level. Although the challenge time for each level was very long, making it hard to endure, and there were even some swordsmen who didn't want to wait any longer and directly left, Chu Mu still resolutely passed through level after level. There would be one more virtual swordsman on each level. Their combined strength was not as simple as adding one level after another. 25th level, 26th level, 27th level. The swordsmen who were still waiting stared at the shining 27th level of the Heavenly Sword Pagoda with wide eyes. Their faces were filled with disbelief and shock. 27th level. Such a result was enough to enter the top 10 of the Heavenly Sword ranking. Although they had seen Chu Mu's sword will before and knew that it had reached 21%, it was not a problem for him to enter the top 10. But Chu Mu's challenge speed was too slow, and they had another thought. That was that Chu Mu's comprehension was very high. His sword will was only at 21%, but his battle talent was average. That was why his challenge speed was so slow. Therefore, many people gave Chu Mu an estimate in their hearts that he would probably reach the 20th level or, at most, the 24th level. They did not expect that Chu Mu not only passed the 24th level, but also reached the 27th level. Instantly, everyone was shocked. They almost forgot to breathe as they stared at the 27th level of the Heavenly Sword Pagoda, not daring to make a sound. They did not have any thoughts of Chu Mu failing his challenge. Instead, they wanted Chu Mu to continue challenging and reach the 28th level, and then the 29th level. Not long after, the 27th level dimmed. A breath of time seemed to be as long as a year. The 28th level lit up like a lighthouse in the darkness. Many swordsmen were very excited. Iron. With the cooperation of the 28 powerful virtual swordsmen, the power was many times stronger than on the 20th level. Chu Mu found the best opportunity to kill them one by one. But these swordsmen's adjustment time was getting shorter and shorter. After Chu Mu killed all 28 powerful virtual swordsmen, he was also severely injured and was on the verge of death. Fortunately, before entering the 29th level, he had fully recovered from his injuries and had fully recovered. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 493. Level 29. He made it to level 29. The swordsmen in front of the Heavenly Sword Tower were extremely excited and shouted loudly. Most of them were swordsmen born and bred in the central main sword domain. It might not be a big deal during normal times, but when faced with competition between sword domains, their sense of belonging would become very strong. Originally, the first place of the Heavenly Sword hero ranking was Zhu Wudao, second place was Yan Jiao, and third place was Gu Jianghe. Although the three of them came from different backgrounds and had different experiences, it was undeniable that they were all from the central main sword domain since birth. But now there was a powerful sword hero from the overseas sword domain, Zhong Qingtian, who had not moved for 3 years, in his first attempt at the Heavenly Sword Tower and defeated Zhu Wudao, who had not moved for 3 years. He directly took first place and forced Zhu Wudao to second place. Didn't this mean that Zhong Qingtian's strength surpassed all the sword hero level swordsmen in the central main sword domain? Next, the 3 sword hero kings from the western sword domain, Southern Sword Domain, and Northern Sword Domain also challenged the Heavenly Sword Tower for the first time. They directly occupied the original 5th to 7th place. These 3 people were also sword heroes from the Central Main Sword Domain. It felt like a slap to the face, one slap after another. It was burning and painful, but they could not retaliate. Should they retaliate? Of course. How could they retaliate? Of course, they would challenge the Heavenly Sword Tower and defeat them. The Heavenly Sword Tower mainly challenged the battle talent of the swordsman. Battle talent meant that one was suitable for battle and had a good grasp of all one's abilities. One could use one's strength to the most suitable place and defeat the strong as the weak. This was also why the virtual swordsmen arranged by the Heavenly Sword Tower were so powerful. In terms of cultivation level, concept, sword intent, and so on, they were not inferior to the challengers. And why the challengers could kill them one by one and challenge level by level. It was because the battle talent of the virtual swordsman was fixed. It was a standard that the spirit of the sword tower had collected countless swordsmen and represented the average battle talent level of the swordsman. If the challenger's combat talent was above this standard, they would naturally have the strength to defeat their opponent. If the challenger's combat talent was below this standard, they would only be defeated by their opponent. Zhong Qingtian's combat talent was undoubtedly terrifying. That was why he could reach the 31st level, even though he was killed shortly after entering the 31st level and failed the challenge. With Zhong Qingtian's strength, other than first-rate swordsmen like Zhu Wudao and Yan Zhuyo, no one else dared to dream of competing with him. As for the sword hero kings from the North, South, and South Sword domains, there were people who could compete, but there were very few of them. Now that they saw the 29th level of the Heavenly Sword Tower light up, they knew that Chu Mu had passed the 28th level and entered the 29th level. Such a result had already surpassed the sword hero kings of the South, North, and West Sword domains. At the very least, he could rank 5th, and perhaps even challenge Gu Jianghe. However, less than 30 breaths of time after the 29th level lit up, it suddenly dimmed, as though a flame had been extinguished. Immediately after, a figure flew out from the Heavenly Sword Pagoda and landed safely. It was Chu Mu. Chu Mu's eyes flashed with shock. He didn't expect that although the 29th level only had one more virtual swordsman than the 28th level, their combined strength would increase threefold. After he had been forced to kill a virtual swordsman, his left arm was chopped off, and he lost his balance for a moment. After barely killing another virtual swordsman, he was killed by several sword light. Although he didn't use the dual sword technique, Chu Mu was sure that even if he used Deshang's dual sword technique, it would most likely be difficult to pass the 29th level and enter the 30th level. Moreover, the Heavenly Sword Pagoda wasn't limited to one challenge. Every swordsman only had one chance to challenge it every day. Chu Mu wasn't in a hurry to use all his strength. He was thinking, if he didn't use moon slashing, then could he use a swordsman's ultimate sword technique? After all, swordsmen belong to Earth, and there were only swordsmen on the ancient sword continent. No matter how powerful the spirit of the sword pagoda was, it shouldn't know about swordsmen. Iron slash and spot kill were both swordsmen's sword techniques, and they were different from swordsmen's. If he used them, would the spirit of the sword pagoda also allow the virtual swordsman to have a similar ultimate sword technique? Chu Mu wasn't sure because he hadn't tried it before. Wouldn't it be better if the spirit of the sword pagoda can also allow the virtual swordsman to have a similar ultimate sword technique after I display the swordsman's ultimate sword technique? Chu Mu's eyes suddenly lit up. Creating the two ultimate sword techniques, Iron Slash and Spot Kill, was partly due to Chu Mu's accumulation and partly due to coincidence. It was extremely difficult to create a third technique. However, if he could see different ultimate sword techniques, it would be best to experience them personally. Only then would he have a better chance of creating a third ultimate sword technique. Chu Mu was very clear about the power of a swordsman's ultimate sword technique. When used at the right time, it wouldn't be inferior to moon slashing. As for whether Chu Mu would be instantly killed by the virtual swordsman if the spirit of the sword pagoda really had such an ability, it wasn't within the scope of his consideration. It's out, it's out. Fifth place. Chu Mu, his name is Chu Mu. Sword hero Jin Tian. A clamor of discussion rang out. Chu Mu turned around and saw that on the Heavenly Sword Grand Ranking, a mysterious energy was condensing a name, shining with golden light. Chu Mu, Sword Hero Jin Tian, 1 day, 29 levels. Anything less than a day counted as a day. Chu Mu was also amazed by the magic of the Heavenly Sword Pagoda. One had to know that he hadn't reported his name or identity, but now the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking had appeared. May I ask which sword sect you are from? A swordsman at the side asked after giving Chu Mu a sword salute with a respectful expression. 5th place. Such a sword hero, as long as he didn't die prematurely, would definitely achieve great things in the future. He might even be another sword of Gojoseon. Even if they couldn't befriend him, at least they couldn't be enemies. The necessary respect was necessary. Many swordsmen around also stared at Chu Mu, waiting for Chu Mu's reply. Their thoughts were similar to those of the swordsman who had asked. Chu Mu should be a disciple from some sword sect in the central main sword domain, or a swordsman who had obtained some amazing legacy. I'm from the eastern sword domain. Chu Mu swept a glance, smiled slightly, and said, Eastern sword domain. These swordsmen's expressions changed drastically as they shrieked. Chu Mu ignored them. He only glanced at the pitch-black Heavenly Sword Pagoda and thought to himself that he had gained a lot this time. He strode down the mountain, leaving behind a group of people who were in a daze. At this time, the sky had just begun to brighten, indicating that Chu Mu had spent almost an entire night challenging the Heavenly Sword Pagoda. Chu Mu used the secret flying technique heaven-traversing flight. His speed was extremely fast, and he quickly flew in the direction of Heavenly Sword Town. He needed to have some peace and quiet to properly organize his gains from challenging the Heavenly Sword Pagoda and then absorb and transform them into his own ability. Not long after, Chu Mu arrived at Heavenly Sword Town. However, he didn't directly go to Xiao Qianfeng's hiding place. Instead, he found an inn in Heavenly Sword Town and booked a room for the time being. In the room of the inn, Chu Mu sat cross-legged on the bed and began to reflect. From the challenge on the first floor to the second and third floor, Chu Mu remembered the battles on every floor clearly. It was as if he had challenged them in the exact same way. Time passed little by little. Gradually, it was nearing noon, but Chu Mu was still reflecting. The higher the challenge, the longer the time, and the greater the difficulty. There were more areas worth reflecting on, and naturally, the gains would also increase. The biggest improvement in the challenges of the Heavenly Sword Pagoda was in swordsmanship and footwork. You had to have sufficiently sharp, powerful, and profound swordsmanship to ensure that you could kill the powerful virtual swordsman that was working together. You had to have sufficiently flexible footwork to ensure that you could survive under the swords of the powerful virtual swordsman that was working together. Swordsmanship and footwork were both indispensable. It wasn't until dusk that Chu Mu slowly opened his eyes. The moment his eyes opened, it was as if there were countless human figures crisscrossing within the world of his pupils. Countless sword flashes flew by, appearing extremely chaotic yet sharp. It was like an illusion that only existed for a moment. Chu Mu's pupils became dark and deep, and all the figures and sword light no longer existed. He exhaled heavily, and the sound of wind and thunder suddenly sounded in the guest room, whistling. In the next breath, Chu Mu's body didn't move at all. Instead, he lightly floated up from the bed. Following that, his 2 feet stepped into the air, and like a feather, he floated around the room, gracefully, elegantly, and without a sound. It felt as if Chu Mu had lost all his weight and was constantly floating in the small guest room. In the beginning, He was still a little mechanical, but as time passed, he gradually became smooth and flexible, changing constantly. After a while, when Chu Mu's figure was about to fall, his feet stepped out again. It was as if he was stepping on air, and he floated in the guest room again. His figure was like a ghost, alternating between left and right, up and down. After about 7 minutes, Chu Mu turned around, returned to the bed, and sat down cross-legged. His sitting posture was exactly the same as before, as if he had never moved. This has already surpassed the level of the flying swan illusory steps. Chu Mu's brows were deep in thought, and he muttered to himself, "If that's the case, then let's make it a brand new footwork technique. Its name shall be inverse space Avicii." However, the current inverse space Avicii is only the tip of the iceberg, and to use it, it consumes a lot of sword chi. I can't use it casually, and I still need to slowly think about it in the future. Taking out the Tianhuang stone, Chu Mu began to cultivate, absorbing the desolate qi within the Tianhuang stone to replenish the Tianhuang sword qi that he had consumed. When Chu Mu finished replenishing the Tianhuang sword qi, it was already late at night outside, and the lights were brightly lit. Getting up, Chu Mu finished paying and left the inn. Relying on his powerful memory, he walked into a small alley, and then walked quickly. With a whoosh, he disappeared in a flash, making people think that it was an illusion. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 494. 2 days later, Xiao Qianfeng's injuries were completely healed. His entire body was like an unsheathed sword, emitting a shocking sharpness. His eyes were filled with a strong murderous intent, and Chu Mu had also gained a lot in these 2 days of quiet cultivation. His swordsmanship had improved, and his inverse space steps had been slightly perfected. Boss Xiao, Boss Chu is now famous. Xia Yu, who had just returned, exclaimed in surprise. What's the matter? Xiao Qianfeng asked. Boss Chu is ranked 5th on the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking, Xia Yu exclaimed. He had gone out to gather information, and in the end, he had heard rumors about Chu Mu. Zhen Tian Sword Master Chu Mu, ranked 5th on the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking. No wonder Xia Yu was so surprised. In fact, when he had first heard the news, he had even thought that he was hallucinating. Although Xiao Qianfeng had said that Chu Mu was very strong and definitely not below him, Xia Yu had his own thoughts. No matter what, Xiao Qianfeng and Chu Mu had not met for many years. According to Xiao Qianfeng, when they had separated, their cultivation levels had not even reached the Qi transformation realm. And now they were both in the Qi Si realm. The difference was huge. These years, Chu Mu had always been in the Eastern Sword domain. Although Xia Yu had not been to the Eastern Sword domain, from some books and Xiao Qianfeng's words, he knew that the Eastern Sword domain's cultivation environment was far from comparable to the Central Sword domain. It was at least 10 times worse. Thus, Xia Yu instinctively thought that even if Chu Mu was stronger than him, he would not be too strong. It was already very good for him to be ranked in the top 30 of the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking. Who would have thought that Chu Mu would place 5th in his first attempt at the Heavenly Sword Tower? His ranking was even higher than Xiao Qianfeng's. Didn't this mean that Chu Mu's strength was above Xiao Qianfeng's? After confirming it over and over again, Xia Yu even personally rushed to the peak of Heaven Pass Mountain to see Chu Mu's ranking on the Heavenly Sword Hero roll with his own eyes. After listening to the discussions of other swordsmen and asking about the appearance of this Zhen Tian Sword Hero, he was finally sure that this was the Chu Mu he knew. Could it be that Boss Xiao and Boss Chu come from an extraordinary sect? Xia Yu couldn't help but think to himself. If Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng knew what Xia Yu was thinking, they would definitely laugh out loud. The Azure Edge Sword sect was only a very weak sect in the Eastern Sword domain. If it was placed in the Central Sword domain, it would be like a drop of water in the vast ocean. At this moment, Chu Mu walked in. Junior brother, you've become stronger, Xiao Qianfeng said. Chu Mu was startled at first, but when he saw Xia Yu's expression, he understood. Senior brother, what's the plan? Chu Mu asked. I'm still too weak now. I can't go against the entire Heaven's Burial Sword sect, Xiao Qianfeng said indifferently. The murderous intent in his eyes grew clearer. However, I can't change my cultivation path because of the Heaven's Burial Sword sect. I have to accumulate enough strength before breaking through. Therefore, before I have enough strength to go against the entire Heaven's Burial Sword sect, I can still kill the disciples of the Heaven's Burial Sword sect. Senior brother, you're wrong, Chu Mu said with a slight smile. What's wrong? Xiao Qianfeng was startled. Xia Yu also looked at Chu Mu in confusion. Not you, but us, Chu Mu said, his tone becoming calm. How can such a thing happen without me? Boss Xiao, Boss Chu is right. You can't leave us out, Xia Yu hurriedly said. Xiao Qianfeng looked deeply at Chu Mu and Xia Yu, then nodded. All right, then let the three of us work together and make the Heaven's Burial Sword sect suffer a great loss. Boss Xiao, I've already calculated. Xia Yu hurriedly said. The night 2 days later will be the darkest night in 10 years. It's the most suitable night for us to attack. What's the darkest night? Chu Mu was curious. Xia Yu explained it to him. The so-called darkest night referred to an incomparably deep night, and it was even longer than a normal night. One had to know that for a swordsman who had reached a certain level of cultivation, there wasn't much difference between day and night. It was just that during the night they needed to be more focused. However, the darkest night that happened once every 10 years was different. During the darkest night, even an Origin Realm swordsman's vision would be greatly affected. It would become as blurry as an ordinary person at dawn. Once it was more than 10 meters away, it would be even harder to see clearly. I've cultivated an eye technique. The darkest night won't affect me much, Xiao Qianfeng said. Senior brother Xiao, don't worry. I have the same ability, Chu Mu said with a smile. Perfect vision swordsman wasn't simple either. I don't, Xia Yu said with a bitter face. Xia Yu, we're only going to attack at night. When the time comes, just stay here and wait for us to return, Chu Mu said. Xia Yu's strength wasn't strong. He was only an ordinary sword master. Adding on the characteristics of the darkest night, Xia Yu wouldn't be able to do anything. Instead, he might even become a burden. He knew this, so he could only nod. In the next 2 days, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng did their best to adjust their condition and make all kinds of preparations to ensure that nothing would go wrong. 2 days later, the sun had just set. The sky quickly darkened. Originally, it would take more than 4 hours to reach midnight. However, in less than an hour, it was already late at night. Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng waited patiently. This was because right now it was only the equivalent of a normal night. It was far from enough. In the blink of an eye, another 4 hours had passed. At this time, the night was already very dark. Even the light of the luminous pearl couldn't disperse much of the darkness. It was only like the light of a small candle. It was rather weak. Let's go, Xiao Qianfeng said. His eyes flickered with traces of golden luster in this dark night. Chu Mu nodded. The two of them leaped and disappeared into the night in the blink of an eye. Xia Yu stared with his eyes wide open. Other than darkness, he couldn't see anything. As expected of the once-in-a-decade darkest night, Chu Mu said to himself as he used his footwork. With his perfect vision swordsman, it was easier for him to see the night as day compared to other swordsmen. However, in this darkest night it was greatly affected. 10 meters was relatively clear, but it wasn't as clear as daytime. After 10 meters, as the distance increased, his vision gradually became blurry. At 100 meters, it was basically impossible to see clearly. There was only a vague outline. After 100 meters, it was completely dark. Chu Mu didn't know how effective Xiao Qianfeng's eye technique was, but judging from his fast footwork, it shouldn't be too bad. Junior apprentice brother, the heaven-burying sword sect is located 50 miles north of Tongtian town. There are a total of 10 Origin Realm swordsmen in the sect. Xiao Qianfeng's voice entered Chu Mu's ears. Among them, the sect leader, Zongtian Venerable, is at the complete Origin Realm and has the strength of a sword venerable. In addition, the Great Elder is also at the complete Origin Realm. It is said that he also has the strength of a sword venerable. As for the other 8 elders, 2 of them are at the Origin Realm. Deshang is at the Origin Realm. 4 of them are at the initial Origin Realm. The other 2 are new elders who are at the initial Origin Realm. In order to deal with the heaven-burying sword sect, Xiao Qianfeng had done a fairly comprehensive understanding of the sect. We are still no match for these people, Chu Mu said. That's right. That's why we have to be careful and avoid them. However, they usually stay within the heaven-burying sword sect. We don't need to go too deep. We just need to ambush the heaven-burying sword sect disciples from the outside and cause them losses, Xiao Qianfeng said. Xiao Qianfeng's plan was very simple. He couldn't possibly break through to the 9th transformation realm and then use a few years to break through to the Origin realm just to deal with the heaven-burying sword sect. Doing so would undoubtedly damage his own foundation. Therefore, while he was accumulating strength in the sword hero stage, he ambushed the heaven-burying sword sect disciples. On one hand, it was revenge. It would slowly weaken the heaven-burying sword sect's strength and cause panic among the disciples. On the other hand, it was to hone his own sword Dao. Xiao Qianfeng had inherited the lifeless sword Dao, which was a branch of the Azura sword Dao. It was a sword Dao whose essence was slaughter. Only in slaughter could it shine brightly. As for Chu Mu, other than helping Xiao Qianfeng, his sword Dao philosophy was that the sword is a weapon, and the sword arts are the art of slaughter. Similarly, he could improve his sword Dao attainments through slaughter. As for the revenge of the heaven-burying sword sect, none of them cared. From the moment the heaven-burying sword sect attacked Xiao Qianfeng, it was destined that the enmity between them could only be washed away with blood. Other than the 10 Origin Realm swordsmen in the heaven-burying sword sect, it is said that there are more than 29th Transformation Realm swordsmen. Xiao Qianfeng continued, however, the 9th Transformation Realm swordsmen are usually in seclusion. They basically won't appear. Otherwise, once their lives are threatened, all their previous efforts will be wasted. Therefore, as long as we avoid the 10 Origin Realm swordsmen, there will be no opponents in the heaven-burying sword sect. Confidence, incomparable confidence, was revealed from Xiao Qianfeng's words. The heaven-burying sword sect's sect master might have a powerful backer, but it was still a new sect that had only been established for a few decades. A sect wasn't made up of swordsmen. Perhaps a few decades could allow a swordsman to reach the Origin realm, but for a sect in the Central Sword region, it was merely a new stage. It was like a growing child. Only after a few hundred years could a sect be considered to have a firm foothold and have a certain level of foundation. There wasn't a single swordsman from the heaven-burying sword sect in the top 100 of the heavenly sword ranking. Even if there were a few sword grandmasters among the Qi-Hai swordsmen in the heaven-burying sword sect, Xiao Qianfeng firmly believed that they wouldn't be a match for him. Not to mention, there was still the even stronger Chu Mu. If the two of them worked together, they would definitely be able to turn the heaven-burying sword sect upside down. Not long after, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng had already left heaven-burying town and were rapidly leaping towards the north. Under the darkness of the night, unless one was a swordsman who cultivated eye techniques, everyone else would be blind. Even light couldn't be emitted. Under such a night, heaven-burying town was unusually quiet. 50 li wasn't far for Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng, especially when there was no obstruction. Gradually, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng could vaguely see the outline of a row of buildings. Their blood began to boil. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 495. The Heaven-Bearing Sword Sect was located 50 miles north of Tong Tian Town. It was backed by a mountain range, with a forest to the east and a valley to the west. The location was quite good. Normally, the disciples of the Heaven-Bearing Sword Sect could enter the valley, forest, or mountain range to train and hunt the monsters inside. On one hand, they could increase their combat experience, and on the other hand, they could earn contribution points by hunting monsters. Tonight was a dark night. Early in the morning, the disciples of the Heaven-Bearing Sword Sect, except for those who were on a long journey, had all returned to the Sword Sect. Because of this, they couldn't see their fingers in front of them, so they could only obediently stay in the Sword Sect. Of course, patrolling was still necessary. All the patrolling disciples were formed into a small patrol team of 10 people. Everyone carried a bright light pearl, and with the light from the 10 bright light pearls, they could still see things clearly within 10 meters. When Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng silently approached the Heaven-Bearing Sword Sect, the light from the bright light pearls in the hands of the patrolling disciples was as eye-catching as fireflies in the dark. "Junior Marshal Brother, why don't we split up and eliminate all the patrolling teams?" Xiao Qianfeng sent a message. "Okay," Chu Mu replied. The two of them immediately separated, as if they had become one with the night. For this night attack, they had changed into black robes. In this kind of night, even if they were suddenly hit by the light from the bright light pearls, their opponents would not be able to react in time. One breath, they only needed one breath's time, and they would be able to kill them. In the blink of an eye, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng couldn't see each other because they were more than 100 meters away. Their speed was extremely fast, and they were silent. The Heaven-Bearing Sword Sect occupied a large area with countless houses. There were a total of 10 patrolling teams of disciples. Each patrolling team had a total of 10 people, and each team was led by 2 Qi-Hai swordsmen and 8 Qi transformation swordsmen. In an environment like the central main sword domain, as long as one had the heart to train for a few years, entering the Qi transformation realm would be easy, and entering the Qi-Hai realm would not be difficult either. It could be said that with a good sword Qi art and the help of some pills, a normal person would be able to reach the Qi-Hai realm within 15 years. These patrolling disciples had a visual range of 10 meters, while Chu Mu had a visual range of 100 meters. In other words, even if Chu Mu stood 10 meters away from these patrolling disciples, they still wouldn't be able to see Chu Mu. As for sensing through aura fluctuations, it was even more difficult because Chu Mu was very good at hiding his aura fluctuations. After spending half an hour walking around the periphery of the Heaven's Burial Sword Sect, Chu Mu used his powerful memory and amazing thinking simulation ability to present the periphery of the Heaven's Burial Sword Sect in his mind. Now that the knife was sharpened, it was time to chop the firewood. The disciples of the 10 patrol squads patrolled very quickly. They would meet up with each other every 15 minutes or so. If they killed one of the squads and didn't meet up with each other after 15 minutes, it was very likely that it would arouse the suspicion of the other squads. Of course, if he could kill all the disciples of the 10 patrol squads within 15 minutes, then he wouldn't be exposed. It seemed that Xiao Qianfeng also had the same idea. Chu Mu started to move. His speed was extremely fast. He used the flying swan illusory steps and appeared behind one of the patrol squads in the blink of an eye. He unsheathed the monster-slaying sword. Although the light emitted by the 10 bright light pearls illuminated a 10-meter radius, it still couldn't reach the level of daytime. Chu Mu's appearance was too sudden, and his flying swan illusory steps, which already had a hint of transcendence, was even more mysterious and unpredictable. The monster-slaying sword flashed under the light of the bright light pearls, and 10 blurry sword light flashed across the sky. With a slight muffled sound, the bodies of the 10 disciples stiffened and then softly fell to the ground. A blurry figure quickly circled around and caught the 10 dead disciples one by one, and then gently fell to the ground one by one. The purpose of this was to avoid causing a big shock. Of course, Chu Mu could also use his sword chi to stop them, but the sword chi would fluctuate, and it would be hard to avoid being detected. It was better to be safe than sorry. On the other side, Xiao Qianfeng was also silently hunting and killing. His sword was incomparably sharp. Often, when it was unsheathed, it would take away a life. With Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng's strength, the patrol squads of the Heaven Burial Sword sect were too weak. Even if they were prepared, they could still kill them in a head-on battle, not to mention this kind of sneak attack where the other party didn't notice. In less than 15 minutes, the 10 patrol squads were completely annihilated. Other than Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng, no one else knew. After killing the last patrol squad, Xiao Qianfeng approached, and the two of them met up again. It just so happened that after each of them killed 5 patrol squads, each patrol squad swordsman had a low-grade spatial bracelet and a mid-grade spatial bracelet, and they all belonged to Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng. After the two of them met up, they chatted for a while and then separated again. Only 100 Heaven Burial Sword sect disciples were not enough. Although the Heaven Burial Sword sect was a new sect, there were thousands of disciples in the sect. 100 was only a small part of the total. The Heaven Burial Sword sect was divided into outer and inner disciples. The outer disciples were at the Qi transformation realm, while the inner disciples were at the Qi Si realm. There were no Sword Qi realm disciples, because only those who had reached the Qi transformation realm were qualified to join the Heaven Burial Sword sect. The outer disciples lived in the outermost area, the inner disciples lived in the middle, and the innermost area was where the elders lived. In the middle was where Venerable Zhang Tian, who had the strength of a sword sovereign, lived. As for the 9th transformation realm disciples, they were all in seclusion. As for where they were exactly, no one knew. After all, the 9th transformation realm was a very special realm. The less people who knew where they were in seclusion, the better, and the less they would be disturbed. Of course, there were also some 9th transformation realm swordsmen who knew that they had no hope of breaking through to the origin realm. They gave up on the breakthrough and went out to train, hoping that they would have a fortuitous encounter that would allow them to break through the shackles and reach the origin realm. Although origin realm swordsmen were nothing in the central main sword region, to many swordsmen, they were still unreachable existences. The outer disciples were dispensable, so Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng placed their focus on the inner disciples. After all, nurturing Qi transformation realm swordsmen and Qi Si realm swordsmen were two different concepts. According to the information that Xiao Qianfeng received, the Heaven Burial Sword sect, which had thousands of disciples, only had about 600 inner disciples, which was about 600 Qi Si realm swordsmen. It was said that there were less than 100 Qi Si realm swordsmen who had the strength of a sword master. In the Eastern Sword region, there were only about 1,000 sword masters. But in the Central Main Sword region, this number was thousands or even tens of thousands of times more. And there were even more swordsmen who had the strength of a sword master through hard work. The 100 or so swordsmen who had the strength of a sword master were the disciples that the Heaven Burial Sword sect focused on nurturing. The area where they lived was closer to the elders. However, the distance between the inner disciples' area and the elders' area was at least a few thousand meters, perhaps to show off the elders' status. Normal origin realm swordsmen couldn't project their mental strength outward. Therefore, unless Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng's movements were too loud, the origin realm elders who were in meditation definitely wouldn't be able to detect them from a few thousand meters away. Every sword tower had a corresponding seal. The outer disciple's sword tower seal could block the full force attack of a normal Qi Si realm swordsman without breaking. The inner disciple's sword tower seal could block the full force attack of a normal sword master without breaking. With Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng's strength, they didn't need to use their full strength to break a seal of this level. However, if they used such a violent method to break a seal, it would create a loud noise that would immediately alert the origin realm swordsman. When the night attack failed, they would have to run for their lives. Luckily, Xiao Qianfeng gave Chu Mu a golden needle. He only had 2 of these golden needles. According to him, they were the treasures he obtained from the place where he obtained the inheritance of the lifeless sword path. The golden needle was not long, about the size of a normal person's sewing needle. Its hardness was comparable to a mid-grade sword, but its toughness was amazing. Even if it was bent, it would not break. The killing power of this needle was very limited, and it only had one use: seal breaking. Seal breaking, as the name suggested, was to break seals. It was not done by brute force, but by the special nature of the golden needle and the special power it contained. The name of the golden needle was seal-breaking golden needle. Chu Mu came to a sword tower and took out the seal-breaking golden needle. Upon closer inspection, one could see that the small golden needle was engraved with countless patterns. These patterns were either in the shape of spirals or ripples. They crisscrossed and looked very mysterious and ancient. The person who was able to create such a treasure was definitely not simple. The sky-desolate sword qi quietly circulated and poured into the seal-breaking golden needle. The seal-breaking ability of the seal-breaking golden needle was closely related to the user's cultivation. Of course, there was also a limit. Basically, it could break any seal below the origin realm. The seal-breaking golden needle that was infused with the sky-desolate sword qi lit up with a golden light. This golden light was very bright, and the darkness could not completely devour it. However, it could not be seen clearly beyond 1 meter. As the golden needle pierced forward, Chu Mu's sharp senses felt as if it had pierced through something. Immediately after, it was like a red-hot soldering iron falling onto a bubble, instantly melting. In just 1 breath's time, Chu Mu discovered that a large part of the seal of the sword tower had disappeared. Putting away the seal-breaking golden needle, Chu Mu's figure flashed and silently passed through the seal. In the blink of an eye, he had entered the sword tower. Every sword tower was occupied by an inner disciple. When Chu Mu entered the sword tower, the owner of the sword tower was in the middle of cultivation. Thus, his perception of the outside world was reduced to the lowest level. In addition, Chu Mu's movements did not cause any sound, and his sword qi was extremely restrained, making it even harder to detect. The sword light flashed, and in less than 1/10 of a breath's time, it was devoured by the darkness. Immediately after, Chu Mu took the person's spatial bracelet and left the sword tower. The whole process was very short, less than 10 breaths' time. After Chu Mu left the sword tower and passed through the seal slowly recovered, as if it had never been touched. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 496. The dark night was longer than normal night. This kind of night was most suitable for swordsmen who practiced eye technique. The night was dark and windy, and it was a night for killing. With the restriction-breaking golden needles, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng's actions were exceptionally smooth. They deliberately hid their auras. Only swordsmen who were above them in terms of strength and realm would be able to sense them when they approached. Unfortunately, within the heaven-bearing sword sect, there was no one in the Qi High realm who could compare with Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng. A silent massacre was taking place. Every time a sword was drawn, one person would be killed in an instant. After killing them, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng carefully placed the corpse down and looted the spatial bracelet. The people of the heaven-bearing sword sect didn't know that their patrol team had been eliminated long ago, and that someone was brazenly assassinating their disciples. Normally, no one would come out in the dark night. Even swordsmen who practiced eye techniques rarely came out. Not to mention the heaven-bearing sword sect, which was only a new sect, had a powerful backer. The weak couldn't fight against it, and the strong had to be wary of the backer of the heaven-bearing sword sect's patriarch. Time slowly passed. Gradually, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng felt that the sky was about to brighten. Kill one more, then retreat immediately. Muttering to himself, Chu Mu used the restriction-breaking golden needles to break the seal of another sword tower. This sword tower was not eye-catching among the many sword towers. Once Chu Mu snuck into the sword tower, he heard a clear moaning and panting sound. Immediately after, there was a high-pitched scream, as if it wanted to tear apart the dark night. Chu Mu was startled, and then he laughed. Although he was single, Chu Mu knew what had happened just now. On the third floor of the sword tower, there were 3 luminous pearls that emitted intense light, illuminating a radius of 3 to 4 meters. Chu Mu hid in the darkness and looked over. He saw 2 naked figures lying on the bed, one male and one female. The woman's body was voluptuous, and her skin reflected a sparkling luster under the luminous pearls. Tiny droplets of sweat emitted a halo of light, and a touch of pink brought along a hint of temptation. She was lying on the man's body, and as she panted, her voluptuous body rose and fell slightly. From Chu Mu's angle, he could see that the lower bodies of the man and woman were still tightly joined together. Really? For a moment, Chu Mu didn't know what to say. In this dark night, the majority of the people were staying in their own sword tower, cultivating or resting. However, there were 2 people here who were different from the others. However, this was also a good thing. Chu Mu had already decided to leave after this assassination, which was equivalent to killing one more person. Trying his best to hide his aura, Chu Mu sensed the aura fluctuations of that man and woman, looking for the best opportunity to attack. He wanted to kill 2 people with one sword strike. Kill. In an instant, just as the man and woman were about to turn around and continue their lovemaking, Chu Mu attacked. The monster-slaying sword seemed to come from the void. The sword light penetrated the darkness of the luminous pearls. The man's reaction was extremely fast. He quickly grabbed the longsword at the side and pulled it out. He slashed backwards with lightning speed, tearing the sky apart. However, just as he slashed out, his head was chopped off by the monster-slaying sword. Even the female swordsman's head was chopped off by the monster-slaying sword. She couldn't even let out a scream. 2 lives with one sword strike. Chu Mu's figure flashed and caught the longsword that almost fell to the ground. He gently placed it down. Although there was a seal that could isolate sound, now that the seal was slightly melted, it was easier for sound to travel out. Perhaps even if the sword fell to the ground, no one would notice. But what if? Chu Mu wanted to make sure that nothing would go wrong. After quickly putting away the spatial bracelets of the man and woman, Chu Mu quickly left the sword gauntlet. The seal of the sword gauntlet was restored again. Looking at the sky, Chu Mu didn't continue the assassination. Instead, he quickly left and waited at the place where he parted with Xiao Qianfeng. After about 30 breaths, Chu Mu saw a blurry figure rapidly approaching. It was Xiao Qianfeng. The luminous night is almost over. Let's go. Xiao Qianfeng didn't stop. He transmitted his voice to Chu Mu and the 2 quickly left. They moved at full speed like 2 bolts of lightning, shuttling through the land of the luminous night. Soon, they were far away. Both of them had a large number of spatial bracelets on them, but they didn't make any noise because of their high speed. They didn't move at all. It was enough to show that their control over their own strength had reached an astonishing level. Senior Martial Brother, I wonder how furious the heaven-burying sword sect master will be after daybreak. Chu Mu transmitted his voice with a smile. Yes, this is just the beginning. The destruction of the heaven-burying sword sect will be one of my goals now. Xiao Qianfeng also smiled. Before daybreak, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng quickly returned to the remote house. Boss Xiao, Boss Chu, you're finally back. Xia Yu, who was restless, was extremely excited when he saw them. And at this time, the luminous night had finally passed, and the sky returned to normal. Soon, the sky would be bright again. Boss Xiao, Boss Chu Yu. Xia Yu's eyes widened as he stared blankly at the numerous spatial bracelets hanging on Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng. His mouth was wide open, and he couldn't say anything for a moment. These are part of the spoils of war. Chu Mu smiled and put down all the spatial bracelets. Xiao Qianfeng also put down all the spatial bracelet. After counting them, there were more than 100 spatial bracelets. This didn't include the majority of the low-grade spatial bracelets that Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng gave up. After all, the low-grade spatial bracelets were used by the weaker disciples. They probably didn't have anything good in them and weren't worth taking away. Most of these spatial bracelets were middle-grade spatial bracelets, and a small portion were upper-grade spatial bracelet. Chu Mu discovered that there was actually a supreme-grade spatial bracelet. He recalled that this supreme-grade spatial bracelets belonged to the male swordsman and female swordsman that he killed. Thinking of the swordsman's fast reaction and strength, if it wasn't for a sneak attack, it wouldn't have been so easy to kill him. Unfortunately, the swordsman's reaction was wrong. If he had shouted, Chu Mu might have been exposed, and he would have been chased by the heaven-bearing sword sex origin realm experts. "Let's tidy it up," Chu Mu said. The three of them immediately busied themselves, inspecting the items in each spatial bracelet. Most of them were spiritual stones and elixirs. A few of them were swordsmanship techniques and so on. Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng didn't care about them. "This is..." Chu Mu inspected the only supreme-grade spatial bracelet. Not only did he find a few thousand upper-grade spiritual stones and some decent elixirs, he also found a silk booklet. Heaven-bearing secret sword. There were 4 words on the silk booklet. Chu Mu quickly flipped it open and read it. After a while, a trace of joy appeared on his face. It turned out that the heaven-bearing secret sword wasn't a sword technique, but an offensive secret art. According to the description, once the heaven-bearing secret sword was mastered, its power would be terrifying. It could unleash an attack 10 times stronger than one's own. "Senior brother, Xiaoyu, take a look." Chu Mu handed the silk booklet to Xiao Qianfeng and said. He didn't have any intention of hiding it. After Xiao Qianfeng received it, he quickly scanned through it. His expression changed as he passed it to Xiaoyu. Xiaoyu also quickly scanned through it and was extremely excited. Heaven-bearing secret sword. The power of this offensive secret art is too strong. Heaven-bearing secret sword. Heaven-bearing sword sect. Venerable heaven-bearing. There must be a connection between these 3. Venerable heaven-bearing once killed a sword venerable. Perhaps it was due to the heaven-bearing secret sword, Chu Mu said. This possibility was very high. Of course, it was also possible that Venerable Heaven-bearing himself had the strength of a sword venerable. Then, with the heaven-bearing secret sword, he would be even more terrifying. "I killed Venerable Heaven-bearing's son, but I didn't get this secret art. Junior brother must have killed someone very important to Venerable Heaven-bearing," Xiao Qianfeng said. "It's possible." Chu Mu nodded and said, "This secret art is good. Although it can only be used once, it's extremely useful as a trump card. Let's all cultivate it." "I can cultivate it too?" Xiaoyu was in disbelief. This was a very advanced secret art. It could unleash 10 times the strongest attack. With his strength, once he hit it, it would be enough to kill the top 10 sword masters on the Heavenly Sword Hero ranking. "Of course," Chu Mu said. "Thank you, Boss Chu. Thank you, Boss Xiao." Xiaoyu was extremely emotional. "How about this? You make 2 copies. One for senior brother Xiao and one for yourself," Chu Mu said. "Okay, I'll make a copy now." Xiaoyu immediately got to work. Compared to the secret art of the heaven-bearing secret sword, nothing else was important. Looking at Xiaoyu's anxious look, Chu Mu and Xiao Qianfeng smiled faintly. It was really bright. There was a huge commotion in the heaven-bearing sword sect because the disciples who went out found the bodies of the patrolling disciples. There were 100 of them, without exception. They were all killed with a sword. The person who killed them was extremely skilled in swordsmanship and was very ruthless, a few elders said in a low voice after examining the wounds of the corpses. Their faces were very ugly. Their swordsmanship was not ordinary. From the wounds of the corpses, They could see that the person who killed them was not inferior to them. This made them feel an inexplicable pressure. Who did it? Taking advantage of the dark night to kill the disciples of the heaven-burying sword sect. Could it be for money? I don't think so. Report this to the sect master and let him decide. After a discussion, the elders ordered the disciples to move the corpses to the main hall of the heaven-burying sword sect. The sect master of the heaven-burying sword sect, Venerable Zhang Tian, was alarmed. He appeared in the main hall with the great elders. When they saw the corpses lined up in the main hall, their faces became very ugly. Unexpectedly, someone dared to attack the disciples of the heaven-burying sword sect in the dark night. Although the death of 100 disciples was nothing to the heaven-burying sword sect and couldn't hurt them, it was a great loss of face for the heaven-burying sword sect. Once the news spread out, the heaven-burying sword sect would become a laughingstock. Gather all the disciples. Venerable Zhang Tian's eyes were filled with killing intent as he shouted in a low voice. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation.